Roy Callahan had been farming the same 482 acres for 31 years, and in all that time, he had never once called the police. Not when the grain elevator caught fire in the summer of 2009, and he lost $43,000 worth of stored wheat before the volunteer fire department arrived with trucks old enough to have been on their second owner. Not when someone cut 3 sections of his east fence line 3 winters back and let a neighbor's herd trample 200 yards of freshly seeded rye into mud. Not even when he found old Ed Pruitt face down in the irrigation ditch off County Road 14, which had looked alarming for about 30 seconds before Ed coughed and asked where his truck was. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Roy had loaded Ed into the truck bed, driven him to the emergency room in Harlan without a word to anyone, because the way Roy saw it, the only harm Ed Pruitt had done was to himself, and a man's private foolishness was not the county's business. Roy handled things. That was what Callahan's did. So when the plow blade caught something solid at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in early April, deep in the southeast corner of the bottom 80, Roy did not reach for his phone. He killed the engine of the John Deere 8310 and climbed down and walked back to investigate the way he had walked back to investigate 100 things before it. Whatever was down there, he would understand it on his own terms first. The first scrape of soil he cleared with his hands told him it was not rock. Rock had a specific cold irregularity to it that Roy had spent 31 years learning. This was cold and smooth. He cleared more soil. The color came through clean gray, the particular shade of concrete in the first year after it was poured, before weather and chemistry had time to do anything to it. He pressed his palm flat against the surface and held it there long enough to be certain. Recent. Months old, possibly less. Someone had poured this here, on his land, without his knowledge and without his permission. He stayed kneeling in the field with his hand flat against the slab and listened to the wind move through the wheat stubble around him and the faint sound of a truck on the county road a mile north, and he tried to make an answer that held up. He could not. Roy Callahan was 58 years old that April. He looked every year of it without apology. The face in his bathroom mirror each morning was the face of a man the Kansas sun had worked on steadily for 3 decades. Deep lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at flat horizons. A permanent tan in the skin of his forehead and the back of his neck. His hands were wide and calloused and perpetually marked with engine grease in the knuckle creases, the kind of stain that did not yield to soap for more than a few hours before the work put it back. He was not a large man, but he was solid in the particular way farm work made a person solid, built for use rather than appearance. And he had the deliberate movements of someone who had learned long ago that most problems required patience more than force. Linda had died 11 years ago that spring, 3 weeks before Marcus's 16th birthday. Ovarian cancer, found late, treated aggressively, lost anyway, the way cancer went when it decided to be serious about itself. She had been the kind of person who made a working farm feel inhabited rather than merely operational, who put flowers on the kitchen table during planting season when Roy barely had time to eat, who knew the names of everyone they did business with and remembered what they had talked about the previous time. The farm had not become a worse farm after she died. Roy had made sure of that, because making sure of it was the only useful thing left to do. But the quality of presence in the house had changed in a way that no amount of work or routine could address. The difference between a place where 2 people lived and a place where 1 person worked. He had raised Marcus on the farm from that point forward, which Marcus had experienced, Roy understood, as something between a duty and a sentence. Growing up in Meade County on a working farm was not a childhood that children tended to romanticize. It was early mornings and equipment maintenance, and the particular social poverty of living 12 miles from the nearest school, which held 160 students in grades K through 12. Marcus had been a sharp student, quick to understand and slow to forget, with his mother's facility for reading situations before they were fully explained. The moment he could arrange his life differently, he had. He went to college in Colorado on a partial scholarship, and after that the distance between him and the farm had grown in ways that were both geographic and harder to name. Marcus lived in Denver now, worked for a software company in commercial real estate technology, called on birthdays and major holidays, and occasionally on Sunday evenings when something was bothering him and he needed to talk without admitting that was what he was doing. Roy valued these calls even when they exhausted him. His son was doing well by every measure that mattered to his generation. That was what a father worked for. The farm had been in the Callahan family since 1889, when Roy's great-great-grandfather Emmett James Callahan had come west from Missouri with his wife Agnes, their two young daughters Mary and Clara, a team of horses, a second-hand plow, and the conviction that land along the Cimarron River drainage in Meade County was worth something that most men had not yet decided to see. Emmett was 26 when he staked his homestead claim on 512 acres of flat Kansas prairie and began breaking ground that first spring, because the season was already moving and a man who waited on the Great Plains waited at his own risk. The first winter had been in a sod house that merged with the earth it sat on and smelled of both rain and root. The drought of 1893 had driven 3 neighboring homesteads into abandonment while Emmett held on. The hard years of the late 1890s and the difficult decade that followed had tested him and had not broken him, and by the time Roy's grandfather was born in 1921, the Callahan place was considered one of the more established family operations in the county. Not wealthy by any external standard, but rooted in a way that people recognized. Roy's father had sold 2 parcels in the 1980s to keep the operation solvent during the farm crisis that had broken hundreds of families across the region. 482 acres was what remained of the original 512 when Roy took over at 27, after his father's heart attack in the spring of that year. He had not sold a single additional acre since. This fact had become, over the past 6 years, a source of ongoing friction with nearly everyone in his professional life. Dale Holt was the second generation of a family that had assembled one of the larger farming operations in the county through patient acquisition and efficient management. He was a compact, organized man who wore good boots and spoke with the confident brevity of someone whose decisions tended to produce the results he expected. He had pulled Roy aside at a county agricultural cooperative meeting in January 6 years ago and made the first offer plainly, without pressure, the way a man did when he believed time was on his side and waiting was part of the strategy. The number was fair. Roy had declined. Dale came back the following spring with a higher number. He returned again with a proposal that included a leaseback arrangement allowing Roy to continue farming during a multi-year transition. He came back the spring after that with a number that Roy's accountant Phil Strachan had described as very fair. Roy, I'd be doing you a disservice not to say that directly. Each year the offer was framed a little differently, which Roy gave Dale credit for because the man was not without creativity, but the core proposition never changed. Sell the land, clear the debt, take the money, stop fighting. Roy always said no. The refusals had a cost that was harder to manage than any financial calculation. He saw it in the way people looked at him at community events, at the co-op, across the counter at the hardware store. Not hostility, something that wore at a person more steadily than hostility. The expression people wore when they believed a man was making a mistake he would eventually regret and had accepted that they could not prevent it. His accountant wore it. The loan officer at Farmers and Merchants Bank, a woman named Carla Baines who had managed his agricultural account for 9 years, wore it with increasing frequency during their annual review meetings. Even people who were genuinely sympathetic wore it. The most direct version had come from a man named Jeff Gaines who had farmed 3 miles north of the Callahan place for 25 years before selling to the Holts 2 years ago. Roy had run into Jeff at the Millstone Bar that October, and Jeff had bought the round without asking first and said, with the particular honesty that men allowed themselves in bars when they cared about each other, "There's no shame in knowing when something's over, Roy. There's only shame in knowing it and pretending you don't." Roy had finished the beer and driven home and worked in the machine shed until midnight. He had thought about what Jeff said for weeks after, not because it was wrong exactly, but because it was true from one direction and completely false from another, and he could not explain the false part to anyone who had not grown up in this specific ground. The southeast section of the farm, the field Roy called the bottom 80, sat at the center of what he could not explain. It was the original homestead acreage, the first land Emmett had broken. Roy had farmed it every single year without exception, planting winter wheat in October and harvesting in June and planting again, a cycle that had not been interrupted in his 31 years and had not, as far as Roy could determine from his grandfather's records, been interrupted for much longer than that. He did this partly because the yields held, consistently better per acre than any comparable section of the property in ways that soil testing had never fully accounted for. The agronomist who visited attributed it to natural variation in the sediment profile, to favorable drainage patterns, to the accumulated organic matter of more than a century of continuous cultivation. Roy accepted these explanations because they were available, but they did not fully satisfy him, and he had never pretended to himself that they did. He walked the bottom 80 in the early mornings before the work started the way other people attended services. He would not have said that out loud and had never said it to anyone, but it was true. The field had a quality of presence that the rest of the farm did not have in the same degree, something he had noticed since childhood without having language for it, and had stopped trying to explain in the years since Linda died, because trying to explain things that resisted explanation was a younger man's project, which made the concrete wrong in a way that went past the obvious wrongness of finding an unmarked slab beneath a wheat field. It was wrong the way a violation was wrong. The specific wrongness of finding a door standing open when you had locked it. He spent the first 20 minutes of the investigation clearing soil methodically from around the initial scrape point, following the edges outward with the flat spade he kept in the tractor cab. The concrete extended in both directions farther than the initial impact suggested. He followed the north edge 15 feet before stopping, the south edge 14 feet, and understood that whatever had been poured here was substantial. Not a small pad, not a utility cover, a slab large enough to be a floor. He found the tire tracks at the south boundary before he was done with the perimeter walk, at the low point where the fence line met a dry creek bed. Heavy equipment tires, their impressions partially washed out by a month's weather since they had been made, but still legible to a man who had been reading ground his entire life. Whoever had driven that equipment onto his property had known about the creek crossing. They had known the property. Roy photographed everything, working from the outer edges inward the way his father had taught him to walk a field when something was wrong, then called 911. The deputy who arrived 40 minutes later was Trey Watkins, the son of a woman Roy had graduated high school with, 26 years old, polite and attentive in the way of someone still learning how to carry authority without being obvious about the learning. Trey examined the slab and the tire tracks with genuine focus, wrote in his notebook, and listened carefully to everything Roy told him about the property and the fence lines and the 6 years of offers from the Holts. Then Trey explained the process. The county surveyor would need to document the slab. An investigation would need to establish who had been on the property. These things took time. A few weeks, possibly more. "I want to know what's under it," Roy said. Trey had looked at him with an expression that was not dismissive so much as cautiously neutral. "Whatever's under it is yours, sir. But I can't authorize excavation based on a trespassing report alone. You'd be looking at the surveyor's office first, then the county attorney if you want to pursue damages." Roy thanked him and watched the cruiser leave in a small trail of dust. That evening he called Marcus. The conversation went the way he had known it would go before he dialed. Marcus moved through alarm into concern about liability and complications and eventually arrived at the conclusion that was always waiting for him at the end of these conversations. Perhaps this was, when considered with an open mind, an argument for simplifying things. He said it with the careful preparatory tone he used when he was about to deliver something he considered important and had prepared in advance. Roy looked at the framed photograph of his father above the kitchen table, the one from 1978, his father squinting into the flat Kansas sun holding a coffee cup and not smiling, the way men of that generation appeared in photographs because they had not yet been taught to perform. Roy said goodnight and hung up. He did not sleep. He lay in the iron bed that had been his father's bed before his, and his grandfather's before that, and Emmett's before his grandfather's, and he listened to the house the way he always listened to it in the dark. The sounds a farmhouse made at night were sounds he had known his entire life, wood settling, the furnace cycling, wind finding the small gaps that structures accumulated across generations. These were the sounds of a place that had been standing since 1901 and intended to keep standing. He knew every one of them the way he knew his own breathing. But that night the sounds felt like background to something he was trying to hear through them. He thought about the concrete and the tire tracks and the fence lines cut and repaired twice in 3 years, which he had always attributed to kids looking for access to the creek, but which looked different now. He thought about fresh concrete poured deliberately underground in the oldest part of the farm. He thought about who would do that and why and what they could possibly be looking for. And he thought about the story his grandfather had told him. The old man had been a sparing speaker throughout most of his life. Careful with words the way careful men were careful, saying what needed saying and stopping when it was said. He had not told many stories and had returned to very few of them more than once. But there was one he had come back to a few times in Roy's presence. Always late at night. Always when the two of them were alone at the kitchen table after the rest of the family had gone to bed. It was about sitting beside Emmett's bed in the autumn of 1931 and listening to the old man talk in the weeks before he died. Emmett had been clear in his mind through most of those last weeks, which Roy's grandfather attributed in the telling to the stubbornness of men who decided to remain present until the actual end. He had talked about the farm, about Agnes and the daughters, and the years of building the place up from open prairie. He had talked about what the land had given him and what it still held and what it would continue to hold. There was one sentence Roy's grandfather had repeated both times Roy heard the story, word for word, with the specific precision people used when they were repeating something that had lodged in memory with more than ordinary force. The ground keeps what you give it. Roy had heard that as the farmer's philosophy his entire life. The long compact between a man and his soil. You put work in, you got yield back. He had never once questioned whether Emmett might have meant it more specifically than that. He lay in the dark and the night passed around him, and when the sky began to change in the east, he was already dressed and the coffee was already made. He drove out to the bottom 80 before full light with the flat shovel and the long-handled spade and a battery-powered work light he could stake in the ground. The morning was cold and windless, the field entirely his. He worked for 2 hours clearing the surface of the slab completely, moving in long, steady strokes, mapping the full extent. 22 feet by 38. Large enough to be a substantial room. He was standing in the center of the cleared surface when the early sun came up far enough to throw light at a low angle across the concrete. And that was when he saw the seam. It was barely visible. A line so fine and so precisely made that he would have walked across it repeatedly without registering it under anything but low-angle raking light. But the particular angle of that morning sun was honest about surfaces in a way overhead light never was. And in that specific light the seam declared itself completely. A rectangle, 4 feet by 3, its edges tooled with a precision that did not happen by accident or by approximation. Not a crack. A panel. An access point built directly into the slab. Roy went back to the truck and got the pry bar. 30 minutes of careful work. Not forced. Not hurried. Moving the bar around the full perimeter, clearing packed earth from the joint, tapping where it resisted. When the panel finally moved, it swung back on hinges he had not known were there. Heavy steel set flush into the surrounding concrete, and beneath it was the shaft. Square, concrete-lined, iron rungs mounted in one wall. An electrical cable running alongside the rungs down into the dark. The shaft dropped perhaps 12 feet before it opened into something larger than the shaft itself. Roy held the work light over the opening and looked down into the darkness below. He stood there for a long moment. 31 years on this land. His father's 22 years before his grandfather's decades before that. And beneath this field, beneath the oldest section of the original homestead, something that had been waiting. He called Gerald Oates. Gerald arrived in 25 minutes with the cutting torch in his truck bed and the particular expression Roy recognized from 20 years of friendship as the one Gerald wore when something had already surprised him before he even opened the truck door. He stood at the edge of the open hatch and looked down for a long moment without speaking. "How long has this been here?" Gerald finally said. "Part of it's been here since 1889, Roy said. "Something was added more recently." Gerald looked at the fresh concrete around the hatch. "How recently?" "The concrete above the hatch is fresh. Months, maybe less." Another pause. "You filed a report about the concrete." "Yesterday. Deputy came out. Said it was trespassing. Recommended the surveyor's office." Gerald studied the rungs visible below. "And now you want to go down. I want to know what's in there." Gerald did not argue. He went to the truck and came back with the torch. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Roy went down first. The rungs were cold iron, solid and unmoving, the kind of installation built by someone who had not been cutting corners on anything. They descended one at a time, Roy leading, Gerald behind with the torch over one shoulder and his flashlight in the other hand. 11 rungs before Roy's boots found the floor of the vestibule. The room was 8 feet square with a concrete floor and block walls and a ceiling that left barely an inch of clearance above Roy's head. A steel door in the far wall. The electrical cable from the shaft ran down the wall beside him and disappeared into conduit in the floor. A light fixture above the door, an industrial cage type, genuine and installed with care, the bulb dead. A switch beside the door. Roy tried it. Nothing. Power not connected or the source long dead. But the infrastructure was real and had been installed by someone who planned for ongoing use. Gerald came off the last rung and stood beside him and turned his flashlight slowly around the space. Someone built this, Gerald said. Yes. Not in the last year. No. But the concrete above the hatch was poured in the last year. Gerald crossed to the steel door and examined it the way he examined any piece of mechanical infrastructure, without rushing, his flashlight moving over the frame and the hinges and the deadbolt. Locked from inside, he said. Can you get through the lock plate? Gerald studied the door for another moment, then nodded. Give me 20 minutes. He set up the torch. Roy stepped back and watched, and tried to keep his mind from running too far ahead of what he actually knew. The torch threw orange light against the block walls. The hot metal smell filled the small space, and Gerald worked with the unhurried precision that Roy had always valued in him most. 40 years of fixing and building compressed into the economy of each motion. 18 minutes. The lock plate came free. Gerald killed the flame and let the steel cool for 2 minutes. Then he put his shoulder against the door. It swung inward. Roy stepped through first with the work light, and the space on the other side was not what his mind had been preparing itself for. Not a room. A chamber. Wide and long and high enough to stand fully upright. The ceiling supported by steel beams running in parallel lines. Overhead, the floor was poured concrete, clean and level. Wooden shelving units lined both walls from floor to ceiling, built deep and heavy, the kind of construction meant to carry weight for a very long time without complaint. The shelving units ran the full length of the space, and on them were objects. Hundreds of objects, wrapped in protective materials and sealed containers, each one carrying a small paper label, organized in an order that was clearly not accidental. Roy went to the nearest shelf and held the work light close to the first label he could reach. The ink had faded to brown with age, but remained entirely legible. The handwriting was careful and formal, the deliberate script of someone making a record they expected to outlast them. The date on the label was 1893. Roy straightened slowly. He moved to the next container. 1891. The next, 1895. 1899. 1903. He walked along the shelving unit and the dates moved through the decade with careful continuity. And when he reached the end of the first unit and moved to the second, the dates continued without interruption. 1907, 1912, 1918, 1923, 1926, 1929. He stopped in front of the container dated 1931 and stood there without touching it. Emmett had died in 1931. He heard Gerald moving through the chamber behind him, the slow sweep of the flashlight, the unhurried sound of a man taking time to understand what he was seeing. Roy moved farther along the shelves and the dates continued past 1931, the handwriting shifting, the script less formal and more compact, a different hand continuing what the first had started. Through the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the protective materials changed as the dates advanced. The oldest items were wrapped in something dark and oilcloth-like, the fabric worn thin in places but intact after decades in the controlled air of this place. Farther along, newer materials had been used, archival sheeting and sealed bags of the kind used in institutional conservation work. Some items appeared to have been rewrapped at some point, old wrapping removed and replaced with something more durable, the outer label updated in the newer hand while the original inner label remained inside. Multiple people had maintained this space. Multiple generations had continued what Emmett started. The newest labels Roy found were dated 2019. He stood in front of them for a long moment. 3 years ago, someone had been in this chamber in 2019 and had rewrapped items and relabeled containers with the same care that had been applied to this work since the 1890s. And someone had been here more recently than 2019. The fresh concrete above them was proof of that. Roy could not yet tell what was in the containers. The shapes visible through wrappings gave general indications: boxes of various sizes, tubes that might have held rolled documents or maps, flat packages that could have been books or framed items or stacked papers. Some containers were the size of shoeboxes and others considerably larger. A few items on the upper shelves were wrapped in protective material so carefully applied that the original shape was entirely concealed. All he could say with certainty was that the chamber held a very large number of items that someone had spent a great deal of time and care preserving. Roy. Gerald's voice came from somewhere near the far wall, controlled and level, but carrying a quality Roy had not heard in it before. Roy found him standing at the left wall where the shelving stopped, and the block was directly visible. Gerald's flashlight was pointed at something mounted to the wall, a document frame, bolted directly into the concrete block with heavy hardware. Old, the glass slightly yellowed but unbroken and clear enough to read through. Inside, behind the glass, were papers, handwritten in ink that had aged to sepia, preserved across the decades by the same controlled conditions that had preserved everything else in this place. Roy leaned close and held the worklight steady. The handwriting on the first page was the same as the oldest container labels. Careful, deliberate, shaped by a hand that had not hurried over a single letter. The signature at the bottom was Emmett James Callahan. The date was April 17, 1929, 2 years before Emmett died. Roy read the document once and then read it again. Emmett had written in the formal language of his era, the language of a man making a record intended to be legally clear and permanently legible. He had written that the chamber beneath the southeast field of the Callahan homestead contained the accumulation of what the land had provided him across the years of his life on it, and what had passed through his hands as a consequence of working that particular ground. He had written about categories of what was here without itemizing every piece: documents and instruments of various kinds, objects of value both monetary and historical, materials relating to the history of the family and the history of the region as he had encountered it across a lifetime. He had written that nothing in the chamber was to be sold separately from the rest. The collection was to remain intact and was to remain on the land. It belonged to the ground that had produced it and to whoever kept that ground with the same care Emmett had brought to the keeping of it. He had written, "The person who opens this will know whether they are the right person. The ones who are not right will recognize themselves as well." Then there was a final paragraph, written in ink slightly different from the rest, the pen held by a hand that had been older and perhaps less steady when this portion was added. Roy read it carefully. Emmett had written that beyond the legal provisions above, he had one request. He had spent his life keeping these things against the wrong moment, and he believed the wrong moment had now passed. He did not know when the right one would arrive, because the right moment was not something a man could determine from inside his own life the way he could determine it looking back. But he trusted the person who opened this chamber to judge that question. He had gathered what was here because he believed it was worth preserving. He hoped whoever opened it would agree. The signature again. The date. Roy stood in front of the framed document for a long moment without speaking. Gerald came and stood beside him and read it in the steady beam of his flashlight. When he finished, he was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was choosing his words carefully. "Someone else was here before you," Gerald said. "Found this. Came in." Roy nodded, and then went back up and poured concrete over the hatch. Roy had been turning this over since the moment he had seen the 2019 labels. They found it, and they weren't ready. Or they couldn't move everything in one trip. Or they were interrupted and needed to seal it and come back. He paused. But they knew what was here, or they knew it was worth finding out. Gerald's flashlight moved along the shelving units, over the hundreds of labeled containers. How many people knew about this chamber? Roy thought about the fence lines cut twice in 3 years. The tire tracks at the creek crossing, from someone who knew the property well enough to know where to enter quietly. 6 years of Dale Holt making offers that were always precisely calibrated to Roy's actual financial situation in a way that went slightly beyond what publicly available information could explain. He did not say any of that yet. He did not have enough to build on it. But it was there, taking shape. Somebody knew something, Roy said. Whether they knew exactly what was down here or whether they knew it was worth looking for. Somebody was looking. He pulled out his phone. 3 bars, which was better than the surface sometimes offered in this part of the field. He looked at Gerald. I'm calling Harold Eckert. Gerald nodded once. Roy found the sheriff's direct number in his contacts. Harold had been in the office 14 years, a deputy for 12 years before that, and was the kind of law enforcement officer Roy had come to respect across 2 decades of occasional dealings. A man who had more patience than ambition and more judgment than procedure. He stood in the doorway of the chamber, the work light casting pale illumination over 130 years of careful, faithful accumulation behind him. Harold picked up on the 5th ring. "Harold," Roy said. "It's Roy Callahan. I need you to come out to the farm. Not a deputy. You. Come today." A brief silence. "What's going on, Roy?" Roy looked at the chamber, at the shelving units running the full length of it, at the dated containers and their protective wrappings representing generation after generation of someone maintaining this work. At Emmett's framed document on the wall with its careful handwriting and its signature and its date of April 1929, when Emmett had been dying and had known it and had written down the things he needed to say while the saying was still possible. "I found something under the bottom 80, Roy said. "And I think I wasn't the first one to find it." Another pause. "Something like what?" "Come and see it yourself," Roy said. "Before dark. Come alone and don't say anything on a radio about where you're going." He ended the call and stood for a moment at the threshold. Gerald looked at him. "You think someone's coming back?" "I think whoever poured that concrete above our heads is either planning to come back or is already watching to see what happens next. And I think they've been patient about this for a while." Roy turned and looked at the shaft opening in the ceiling of the vestibule, the square of April sky visible far above them, the iron rungs climbing up toward it. He thought about the bottom 80, about the decades he had walked it in the early mornings and felt something in it that he had never been able to explain. He thought about Emmett at 26 breaking this ground for the first time with a team of horses and a second-hand plow, and whatever it was Emmett had known about this piece of earth that had made him build something under it before he built anything above it. "Until Harold gets here," Roy said, "we stay." Gerald turned off his flashlight, because Gerald was the kind of man who thought about battery life even in extraordinary circumstances. Roy turned off the work light too. They sat in the dark below the oldest field in Meade County, in the space Emmett Callahan had built before he built anything else on this land, and they waited. Above them, the April wheat leaned in whatever wind had found the bottom 80 that morning. Above that, the flat Kansas sky moved through its pale arc with the indifference of something that had witnessed everything and been altered by none of it. And in the dark below, Roy Callahan sat with his back against the block wall and felt the full weight of what was in front of him settle across his shoulders. Emmett had put something in this ground and trusted it to the land and trusted the land to the right person. Someone else had found it first. Roy did not yet know who. He did not yet know what they intended, or how long they had known, or how far they were willing to go. But he was the one who was here now, and he was not going anywhere. Sheriff Harold Eckert pulled his personal truck down the dirt road to the bottom 80 at 3:22 that afternoon, 20 minutes ahead of Roy's mental estimate of when a man driving from Harlan could arrive without rushing. He came alone the way Roy had asked, no markings on the vehicle, no radio traffic announced. He parked at the edge of the field and walked toward the open hatch with his hands in his jacket pockets, taking in the scene with the particular unhurried attention of someone who had stopped performing the job a long time ago and simply did it. Roy met him at the surface. Harold Eckert was 61, built like a man who had been athletic in his youth and had kept most of it through work rather than intention, with gray hair cut close and eyes that had learned over the years to communicate information without much help from the rest of his face. He had a reputation in the county for being fair and a separate reputation among the county's more observant residents for being considerably sharper than his manner suggested. Roy had trusted him for both reasons for 20 years. Harold looked at the open hatch. He looked at the concrete slab, at the cleared soil around it, at the hinges visible at the panel's edge. He took his time with all of it. Then he crouched and looked down the shaft at the iron rungs descending into the dark. He stood back up and looked at Roy. "How long have you been down there?" he said. "Since noon. Gerald's still in." Harold looked at the hatch again. "You opened this yourself." "It's my land." Harold exhaled once through his nose. "All right." He pulled out his phone and made a brief call, speaking in a low, flat voice. Roy caught the words South County Road 18, Callahan property, come quiet, before Harold ended the call and turned back. I'm bringing one person. Patrice Olson. She's been with me 12 years. You can trust her." Roy nodded. Harold went down the shaft first, testing each rung before he committed his weight, moving with the careful efficiency of a large man who had done field work in enough confined spaces to know how to manage them. Roy followed. They moved through the vestibule in silence, through the open steel door, into the chamber. Harold stood just inside the doorway and swept his flashlight through the full arc of the space. He took a long time doing this. Gerald, standing somewhere in the middle of the chamber, waited without speaking, which was one of the qualities Roy valued most in him. "Jesus," Harold said, quietly, to no one in particular. He walked to the nearest shelving unit and held the flashlight close to the first label he could reach. He read the date. He moved to the next one, then the next. He walked along the shelving the way Roy had walked it that morning, dates advancing through the decades, and Roy watched his face and saw the specific expression of a man recalibrating a situation he had believed he understood. "Someone has been maintaining this space," Harold said, stopping at a 2019 label. "Someone who knew it was here. Someone who found it and couldn't take it in one trip," Gerald said. "Or someone who was interrupted." They sealed the hatch and left. Harold crossed to the framed document on the left wall. He read it carefully, the flashlight steady, taking his time with every sentence. When he finished, he stood back. "Roy," he said, "this is not a trespassing report. I know. This is a law enforcement matter of a significantly different order." He looked at the rows of containers, the hundreds of dated labels in their careful chronological sequence. "I need everything documented by someone other than you before anything is touched. If there's a legal challenge to ownership, anything moved without proper documentation becomes a problem. That's partly why I called you instead of going home and opening things myself," Roy said. Harold looked at him. Something passed through his expression briefly, then was gone. "All right. Patrice is 30 minutes out. She's got a professional camera. We document everything first. Then we open a few, carefully, with all of us as witnesses." He opened his notebook. "And Roy, I need everything you know about who else might have been on this property without permission. Everyone who has expressed interest in this land. Anything that seemed off over the last few years. All of it." Roy told him. The fence lines cut twice. The tire tracks at the creek bed that he had always attributed to kids cutting through for creek access. 6 years of Dale Holt's offers. Always precisely calibrated to Roy's actual financial situation in a way that went slightly past what publicly available information should have enabled. The soil survey company that had appeared at his east boundary 2 years ago. Men with equipment Roy had not recognized who said they were working on a county mapping project. Harold wrote and listened with the complete attention of a man who understood that the details that appeared least connected were usually the ones that mattered most. Patrice Olson arrived down the shaft at 4:05, a camera bag over one shoulder and a second flashlight in hand, the manner of someone who had been told to be efficient and intended to be. She looked at the chamber once, nodded to Harold, and began photographing immediately, working in a systematic grid pattern from the entrance inward. The documentation took an hour and 18 minutes. Roy and Gerald sat on the concrete floor near the entrance and waited. The sound of the camera shutter and Harold's low dictation into his phone filled the space. Roy had learned to wait for things a long time ago and had never fully stopped learning it. When Patrice finished and Harold was satisfied with the notes, the four of them gathered in the center of the chamber. "Which container first?" Harold said. Roy looked along the shelving units. He had been thinking about this during the wait. "The oldest date, 1891. Harold put on latex gloves from his jacket pocket and handed a pair to Roy. They approached the first container together. It was the size of a shoebox, wrapped in the dark oilcloth that appeared on all the oldest items, the fabric stiff with age but intact. Roy peeled the outer wrapping back carefully. Inside was a wooden box, its lid secured with a small latch. He opened it. Gold. American double eagles stacked in rows of 5 with protective cloth between each layer. The coins settled against each other with the specific solidity of things that had been lying undisturbed for a very long time. Roy lifted the uppermost coin and held it in the beam of the flashlight. The obverse caught the light the way gold caught light, with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the particular density of the metal. The date stamped on it was 1889. He checked the next coin. 1891. The next, 1890. He counted the rows. 42 coins in total, at a rough estimate. Late 19th century American coinage, Harold said. He was already photographing. Roy replaced the coin he was holding and felt the weight of the box. 40 double eagles in 1891 dollars represented $800, a serious sum for a homestead farmer in that era. Their collector value in the present was something Roy had no way of estimating precisely, but genuine uncirculated American gold coins from the 1880s and 1890s were not worth face value. He understood that much. The second container held documents. Land patents on heavy paper with browned edges and sharp text. He found the original Callahan Homestead patent among them, the government document certifying Emmett's claim on the 512 acres, signed by a land commissioner in Washington and dated July 14, 1889. Roy had seen a copy of this document his entire life. His father had kept one in the office file drawer. But this was the original, the physical paper Emmett had held in his own hands on the day his claim was confirmed. Below the patent were adjacent land claims from Emmett's neighbors in the same period, names Roy recognized from his grandfather's stories. Surveyor's maps of the original township grid, hand-drawn with meticulous precision in the style of the era, showing the section lines and the creek drainage and the early wagon roads. A deed transferring a small parcel from a name Roy did not recognize to Emmett Callahan in 1895 for $4 and other good and valuable considerations in the florid legal language of the period. The third container was larger than the first two. When Roy got through the outer oilcloth, he found a bundle of leather tied with a cord that crumbled at his touch and had to be cut with the penknife Harold produced from his jacket. Inside the leather was a book, small, its cover worn smooth from repeated handling, its spine still tight. He opened the cover. The handwriting was Emmett's. Roy recognized it immediately from the framed document. But where the framed document had been deliberate and formal, this writing was personal, compressed, the hand of a man writing to himself rather than for posterity. The date at the top of the first entry was March 14, 1892. Roy read it in the beam of the work light, aware of Harold and Gerald and Patrice standing around him in the careful silence of people who understood that what was being read was not for them to rush. Emmett had written about the spring of 1892 in the plain, economical language of a man who wrote to remember rather than to impress. He had been plowing the southeast corner of the homestead for the second time, the original sod having been broken the previous year and the ground now being turned again to kill the remaining grass roots before seeding. His team had been working the far corner when the lead horse stumbled. Emmett had stopped to check the animal's leg and had found, while doing so, that the ground beneath the horse's hoof had given way slightly in a manner inconsistent with normal soil. He had dug at the spot after unharnessing the horses, and had found at a depth of roughly 3 feet a cavity in the earth. The cavity was natural, a dissolution feature in the underlying limestone, the kind of thing that formed in the geology of this region over thousands of years of groundwater chemistry, working its way through porous rock. Emmett had enlarged it carefully and found it to be stable and dry and located in exactly the most sheltered and least trafficked part of the homestead. He had, he wrote, understood immediately what the cavity was for. Gerald made a sound beside Roy that was not quite a word. Roy read on. Emmett had spent that spring building down. He had done it alone, working at night and before the family woke, carrying materials from the barn and from town in small quantities over several weeks so the accumulation would not draw attention. He had enlarged and lined the cavity, built the vestibule, installed the access shaft. The work took 2 months. His wife Agnes had known because there were no real secrets in a sodhouse homestead where 2 people shared every working hour, but she had agreed it was right and had helped him think through the shelving design. What Emmett had needed the space for was a convergence of circumstances he described with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything else in the journal. In the spring of 1892, 3 different families in the county had come to him separately, asking if he would hold their most valuable documents and portable property for safekeeping. The combination of drought, collapsing commodity prices, and the specific lawlessness that accompanied economic distress on the frontier had made people afraid. They were afraid of banks, afraid of fire, afraid of the men who moved through hard-luck country looking for opportunity in other people's desperation. They came to Emmett because Emmett had a reputation for straightness that he had earned through the preceding 3 years and intended to keep. He did not write about this with pride. He wrote about it the way he wrote about everything practical, as a fact requiring a response. One family had left the territory entirely before they could reclaim what they had entrusted to him, their whereabouts unknown. Another had lost their patriarch to illness before the recovery could be arranged. A third was in the middle of a legal dispute where recovering their property would have required disclosing its existence to parties who intended to take it, and so they asked Emmett to continue holding it indefinitely. Emmett had kept everything, waiting, adding to it himself as the farm prospered, and he had things worth protecting, adding to it on behalf of others who found their way to him over the following years through the informal networks of trust that communities built when formal institutions could not be relied upon. He had been, Roy understood now, reading this, the custodian of a significant portion of Meade County's portable wealth for the better part of 40 years. Not through fraud, not through acquisition of what was not his, through the exercise of the quality that the frontier valued above all others, reliability. The kind that never asked for acknowledgement because it did not need it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Harold, who had been reading over Roy's shoulder for the last several pages, straightened and looked at the shelving units with an expression Roy had not seen on him before. Roy understood what Harold was recalibrating. The chamber was not just a family collection. It was a custodial archive, a private vault for an entire community's irreplaceable things, kept by one man and maintained by the generations who followed him because they understood the weight of what had been entrusted. Roy turned to an entry near the back of the journal, dated 1929, the year Emmett had also written the framed document. This entry was longer than most, the handwriting slightly less controlled, the pen of a man who was older and who may have been unwell on the day he wrote it. Emmett had written that he was old and felt it, and had been thinking about what happened to the contents of the chamber after his death. He had not told his son. His son was a good man, but not a careful one, and the contents of this place required care above everything else. His grandson, the boy who would one day become Roy's grandfather, was 10 years old, and Emmett had watched him for 2 years already with the particular focused attention an old man brought to looking for something he needed to find. The boy was careful. He had the quality. The thing Emmett had tried to give him was not the knowledge of the chamber, which was not knowledge he could be trusted with at 10 years old, but the understanding that this ground held more than it showed on the surface, and that the keeping of it mattered in ways that reached further than any single generation could see. The ground keeps what you give it. Roy closed the journal and held it in both hands around the worn leather cover, the way he would hold something breakable that he intended to keep. He had spent his whole life believing that sentence was a philosophy, a way of thinking about the relationship between work and yield. He had walked this field for 31 years with Emmett's words somewhere in the back of his understanding, treating them as a generality, because that was the level at which they had been given to him. They had never been a generality. He put the journal down on the concrete floor beside him with the care he would bring to the most fragile thing he owned, and stood up and looked at the chamber. At the 273 labeled containers he had not yet opened. At the shelving units stretching to the back of the space. At the framed document on the wall with Emmett's signature and the date of April 1929. "There's something else," Gerald said. He was standing near the back of the chamber, where Roy had not yet been. In the back section, they went together, all 4 of them, with their lights. The back section was separated from the main chamber by a change in shelving configuration, the units here wider and deeper, built for larger items. Along the right wall were 4 pieces, floor standing, wrapped in heavy canvas tied with rope, each roughly the size of a large steamer trunk. The labels on these were different from all the others. Larger, more formal, the description written in ink that had been applied with a wider pen, the way a person wrote when they intended the label to be read from a distance. Roy crouched beside the nearest one and read. The original date was 1924. In Emmett's handwriting, the content description read, "Maps and Survey Instruments. Original Field Surveys 1888 to 1923. Mineral Documentation." Below the original label, attached with its own cord, was a second tag in the smaller, more compact handwriting that had appeared on the 2019 labels. This tag said, "Do not open without specialist present. Fragile." And beneath that, in the same hand, "Do not allow access to this section by any party other than the landowner." Roy read the second tag twice. Harold crouched beside him and read it too. They were both quiet for a moment. "Mineral documentation," Harold said. He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, but Roy had known him long enough to hear what was underneath. Roy stood and looked at the 4 canvas-wrapped items. He thought about the 2 geological tests that had been done on his property in his lifetime. The results described to him both times as inconclusive or below commercial threshold. He thought about a soil survey company at his east boundary 2 years ago with equipment he had not recognized. He thought about 11 records requests filed on his property over 4 years, which he did not know about yet, but Harold was about to find out. He thought about Meade County's position in southwestern Kansas, about the geology of the region, about the conversations he had overheard at county meetings over the years about the natural gas formations that underlay this part of the state and the production activity that had been expanding steadily in adjacent areas while the Callahan property sat above whatever it sat above and produced wheat. "We need a specialist for these," Roy said. He turned to Harold. "Someone from the State Historical Society who knows original survey documents. Before anything in this section gets opened." Harold nodded. "I know who to call. She's in Topeka, but she's worked in this county." He paused. "Roy, before we leave here tonight, I need to make some inquiries about records requests on this property. Any requests filed at the county clerk's office in the last several years would be logged. I can have someone check that tonight." Roy said, "Call me when you know." They spent another hour in the chamber, working methodically through additional containers, photographing each open piece and its contents before anything was disturbed. Gold appeared again in 2 more containers, different denominations, different eras, but all pre-1933 American coinage. A third held a leather pouch containing silver coins from the territorial period mixed with older items Roy could not immediately identify. A fourth held a bundle of letters, the envelopes addressed in a hand Roy did not recognize to addresses in Missouri and Ohio, the letters themselves sealed and unread. Harold photographed everything and dictated careful descriptions. Patrice cross-referenced each photograph against her inventory log. Gerald assisted where hands were needed and was otherwise quiet in the specific way he was quiet when he was thinking through something he was not yet ready to say. By the time they climbed back up the shaft, the sun was low and the bottom 80 had gone gold with late afternoon light, the wheat stubble catching it and holding it longer than the surrounding land usually held it, the way this field had always done and Roy had always noticed without quite understanding. He replaced the panel over the hatch. Gerald helped him spread loose soil over the surface, smoothing it to approximate the surrounding ground well enough that a passing vehicle on the county road would not notice anything unusual. Not to hide what was there, but to avoid advertising it while the situation was still taking shape. Harold stood by his truck and made 2 calls before driving away. Roy heard the name Holt in the second one and watched Harold's face and saw the response register in it the way information registered in Harold's face, which was barely, but unmistakably. "I'll call you tonight," Harold said. Roy drove home in the long, slow dusk. The farmhouse appeared against the darkening sky the way it had appeared against every dusk Roy had ever driven toward it, plain and square and permanent in the way of things built to last rather than to impress. He made dinner and ate without much attention to it, and sat at the kitchen table with Emmett's journal, which he had brought up in an archival bag Harold had provided. He did not open the journal again. He sat with it on the table in front of him and thought about the chamber and the containers and the canvas-wrapped items in the back section and what the word mineral meant when it appeared in Emmett's handwriting in 1924. Harold called at 9:42. 11 records requests on your property, Harold said, without preamble. Filed at the county clerk's office over the last 4 years. The frequency increases significantly in the last 18 months. Roy waited. 3 are from a geological survey company incorporated in Nevada with an operating address in Wichita. 2 are from a law firm in Wichita I'm continuing to run down. 4 are from an agricultural consulting operation based in Liberal. He paused. The last 2 are from an entity called HCM Land Holdings. Roy had seen that name. HCM stood for Holt Capital Management, the holding company above Dale Holt's farming operation and several other investments. Roy had encountered it 3 years ago when he had briefly consulted an attorney about the hold offers. The Geological Survey Company in Nevada, Roy said. I'm looking at that tonight, Harold said. Preliminary indication is that the principal on the Nevada registration is connected to the Wichita law firm, the same firm that handles HCM Land Holdings legal work. Roy let that sit for a moment. They've been coordinated, he said, using entities that don't look connected. That's what it looks like from where I'm standing, Harold said. Roy, whoever has been researching your property for 4 years has resources, and they have been systematic about it. The fact that they poured concrete over the hatch rather than taking what was in the chamber tells me they encountered a complication, something that required more time or more preparation before they could act. Roy thought about the second tag on the canvas-wrapped items. Do not allow access to this section by any party other than the landowner. Written in 2019 by whoever had maintained the chamber last. A warning left by someone who understood what was in those items and understood who was trying to get to it. Someone was down there in 2019, Roy said. Someone who knew about the chamber and also knew what the people looking for it intended. They relabeled and rewrapped and left a warning and then sealed the hatch. Harold was quiet for a moment. That's a possibility. Who would do that? I don't know yet, Harold said. But I'm going to find out. He paused. The State Historical Society specialist. Carla Hutchings. She can be there the day after tomorrow. Roy thanked him and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, not doing anything purposeful, just sitting with the journal in front of him and the sounds of the house around him. Then his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He looked at the screen for a moment before opening it. Mr. Callahan, you don't know me. My name is Thomas Ryder. I'm an agricultural attorney in Topeka. I've been representing certain interests related to your property for approximately 3 years. I'm reaching out tonight because I believe you've recently discovered something that my clients had hoped to recover quietly. I'd like to speak with you before this becomes more complicated than it needs to be. I'm available at any hour. Roy read it twice. He set the phone down beside Emmett's journal and looked at the two objects on the table in front of him. A leather-covered journal that had been in a controlled climate chamber below his wheat field for 131 years, and a text message from a lawyer at 11 o'clock at night. He forwarded the text to Harold with one word, tonight. Harold responded in less than 2 minutes. Seen. Don't reply. I'll call in the morning. Roy turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a while. He did not have this habit because there was anything wrong with having the lights on. He had it because some problems arranged themselves more honestly in the dark, without the distraction of the room making itself known. He thought about Thomas Ryder and the 11 records requests and the survey company connected to HCM Land Holdings. He thought about the 2019 visit to the chamber and the warning tag and the fresh concrete. He thought about 4 years of systematic, coordinated research into his property by people who had the resources and patience for a sustained campaign, and about the fact that they had gotten very close and then something had stopped them. He thought about what that something might have been. He went to bed at midnight and did not sleep well, which was becoming a pattern he recognized and could not do anything about. He was up at 5. Harold called at 7:15 while Roy was eating breakfast. The Geological Survey Company, Harold said. The Nevada Incorporation. The principal on the registration is a man named Gary Farrell. Gary Farrell is Dale Holt's brother-in-law. He gave Roy a moment to take that in before continuing. The Wichita law firm handles all of HCM Land Holdings legal work. Same firm, different attorneys for different matters, but the same firm. He paused. And Roy, the 2 geological tests done on your property, the ones that came back inconclusive. Roy set his coffee cup down. The 1999 test was a genuine state survey, Harold said. But the 2011 test was commissioned by an agricultural consulting company based in Liberal, Kansas. One of the same entities that filed records requests on your property. Roy looked at the kitchen wall above the table. The photograph of his father from 1978 hung there where it had always hung, his father squinting into the flat sun with a coffee cup in his hand. The 2011 test was designed to come back inconclusive, Roy said. It was not quite a question. Harold was careful. I think we need Carla Hutchings to look at those canvas-wrapped items before we draw any formal conclusions. But yes, that is the direction I'm looking. Roy stood and put his plate in the sink and looked out the window at the bottom 80. Visible in the morning light from the kitchen window, the flat stretch of it running to the creek bed at the south boundary, the disturbed patch of soil above the hatch invisible from this distance. The Hugoton gas area ran through southwestern Kansas. Roy knew this the way he knew most things about the regional geology, as background, as context, as information relevant to neighbors, and not quite to him. The Hugoton Formation was one of the largest natural gas reservoirs in North America. It had been producing since the 1920s. The development had moved in waves through the region across the 20th century, and the activity in adjacent counties had been expanding in the years since the hydraulic fracturing techniques that had made previously uneconomical wells productive had become standard. Roy's property sat in a position relative to the formation that people in the industry had views about. He had heard the views expressed at county meetings. He had never heard them expressed in relation to his own land because the 2011 geological test had settled that question in the minds of everyone who relied on it. Everyone who relied on a test that had been commissioned by an entity connected to Dale Holt's holding company. Roy picked up his phone and called the number for Patricia Vance, an attorney in Dodge City whom Gerald had mentioned 3 years ago when Roy had briefly thought about getting legal advice on the Holt offers. He had not called her then. He called her now. She answered on the second ring. Roy gave his name and said he needed help with a matter involving his property, historical documents, mineral rights, and what he believed was an organized effort to suppress evidence of rights going back several decades. A brief pause. Then, with the focused brevity of someone shifting into a mode she knew well, "Tell me everything." Roy told her. He went in order, starting with the trespassing report on Monday and working forward through Harold's investigation, the chamber, the journal, the canvas-wrapped mineral documentation, the 11 records requests, the survey company connected to Holt, the 2011 geological test, and the text from Thomas Ryder at 11 o'clock the previous night. Patricia asked 23 questions during Roy's account. Each one was precise and went directly to the detail she needed and stopped when she had it. When Roy finished, she was quiet for about 4 seconds. "The Hugoton Formation," she said. "You understand the significance." "I'm beginning to. The gas rights in that formation have been producing royalties in adjacent properties since the 1920s. If the original mineral rights documentation on your property establishes rights that were either improperly stripped from your family at some point or suppressed by a fraudulent geological assessment," she paused. "Mr. Callahan, the people who have been researching your property for 4 years are not doing it for agricultural reasons. They're doing it because they know, or they believe they know, what those mineral rights are worth." Roy stood at his kitchen window looking at the bottom 80. "Tell me what worth means in a number," he said. Patricia was quiet in the way attorneys were quiet when they were deciding how much to say before they had fully reviewed the documentation. The Hugoton Formation has active producing wells in Meade County. If your property sits where I believe it sits relative to the formation, and if the mineral rights are intact and have been properly documented since 1888, she paused again. The royalties alone on a producing operation of that size, over the years of production that have already passed, would constitute a significant claim. Beyond that, the value of the rights themselves in the current market, she stopped. "I don't want to give you a number before I've seen the documents. But I want you to understand that the people who sent you that text last night understand the number. They've had 4 years to calculate it." Roy thought about Dale Holt pulling him aside at the county meeting 6 years ago with an offer framed as simple good sense. About Carla at the bank and Phil the accountant and Jeff Gaines at the Millstone Bar and his son with his careful preparatory tone. About 31 years of being the man everyone in the county expected would eventually have to sell. He thought about Emmett in 1892 finding a cavity in the limestone below the southeast corner of his homestead and understanding immediately what it was for. "What do I do?" Roy said. Patricia's answer was immediate and organized. "Do not reply to Thomas Ryder's text or take any communications from his office. Allow Harold Eckert's investigation to proceed without interference from outside parties. Keep the chamber secured and do not allow access to anyone Roy himself had not authorized. And get Carla Hutchings from the State Historical Society to those canvas-wrapped items as quickly as possible. The mineral documentation in those items," Patricia said, "is almost certainly what the people behind those records requests have been trying to find. It's what the 2011 geological test was designed to bury. And it's what whoever was in that chamber in 2019 understood well enough to protect with a warning. She paused. Who do you think that was? The person in 2019. Roy had been turning this over since Harold's call the previous night. He thought about the people who knew the farm's history well enough to know about the chamber, who had reason to want its contents protected rather than taken, and who understood enough about the Holt operation to know what was at risk. He thought about his grandfather's careful silence for 60 years, holding a sentence he had been given at 10 years old without understanding its full meaning. He thought about the generational chain of maintenance in the chamber, the way the handwriting changed across the decades, but the care did not. He had not yet looked at the 2019 labels carefully enough to identify who had made them. He intended to do that today. I don't know yet, he told Patricia, but I'm going to find out. She told him she would clear time that afternoon to begin reviewing the information he would send her, and that she could be in Meade County by the following morning if the situation required it. Roy thanked her and ended the call. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, looking at Emmett's journal where he had left it on the table. Then he put on his jacket and went out to the truck. He drove out to the bottom 80. Not because there was anything specific to do there before Carla Hutchings arrived tomorrow. He drove out because the field needed seeing in the morning light, the way he had seen it thousands of mornings before, and because he needed to stand in it and feel what it felt like now that he knew what it held and what it had been holding all this time. He parked at the edge of the field and walked to the disturbed patch above the hatch and stood there in the morning. The sky was clear and pale. The wheat stubble caught the early light. The field looked as it had always looked, flat and undemonstrative, without ornament or display. A field that had been worked every year for over 100 years by the same family, each generation planting and harvesting and planting again. Roy stood above the hatch and looked out across the bottom 80 and thought about the people who had spent 4 years trying to get to what was below his feet. 4 years of records requests and survey companies and a fraudulent geological test, and eventually, finally, someone coming down into the chamber and understanding what they had found and then sealing it again. 4 years of patience and resources and coordination, everything the people with money and lawyers brought to problems they intended to solve. And underneath all of it, for 131 years, the ground had kept what Emmett had given it. Roy's phone buzzed. A call from Marcus. I did some research, Marcus said, which was how he began when he had been working on something rather than just calling to check in. About the agricultural consulting company in Liberal, the one that filed records requests on the property. Roy waited. It was incorporated in 2009, Marcus said. 2 years before the geological test that came back inconclusive. The registered agent for the company. He paused. Dad, the registered agent is the same law firm in Wichita that handles the Holt Holding Company's legal work. Roy looked at the field. How did you find that? He said. I called a friend from college who practices business law in Denver. Took him 20 minutes. Another pause, and Roy could hear his son choosing his next words with the care he brought to things that mattered. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said last night. That you didn't know you were right to hold on. You just couldn't be wrong. Roy waited. I've been wrong about this, Marcus said. About what it meant to hold on. I thought it was about the past. I thought you were holding on for Grandpa and Great-Grandpa and all of that. I didn't understand you were actually holding on for a reason that existed in the present tense. Roy did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the field, at the pale light on the stubble, at the flat horizon where the sky met the land. I didn't know about the chamber, Roy said. I know, but you held on anyway. Roy thought about that. Get on a plane, Roy said. If you can get away. I think you should be here when we open those last items. A brief silence. Yeah, Marcus said. I think so too. Roy ended the call and stood for a while longer in the field. The morning was fully up now, the sun clear of the horizon, the day organizing itself around him the way days organized themselves when you were already in the middle of something that would not wait for you to be ready. He had a lawyer. He had a sheriff. He had a state historical society specialist arriving tomorrow. He had his son on a plane. And below his feet, sealed behind a steel door at the bottom of 12 iron rungs, Emmett Callahan's 131 years of careful keeping waited in the dark for the specialist's hands and the morning light. Someone else had found it first. They had gotten close enough to read the warning on the canvas-wrapped items in the back section, close enough to understand what they were looking at and what it meant, close enough to know that taking it would require more than one trip and more than one plan. And then something had stopped them. Roy intended to find out what that something was before anyone tried to finish what they had started. He walked back to the truck and drove toward the farmhouse. There were calls to make and documents to send, and a day of preparation ahead of him before Carla Hutchings arrived tomorrow morning. The ground had held for 131 years. It would hold one more day. Marcus landed in Wichita at 6:40 in the morning and drove the rental car south through the flat country in the early light, calling Roy from the road when he was an hour out. Roy was already in the kitchen with the coffee made and Emmett's journal on the table in front of him, not reading it, just keeping it company the way a person sometimes kept company with something they were not yet ready to put down. He heard his son's voice and felt something ease in his chest that had been tighter than he had realized. Carla Hutchings from the State Historical Society arrived at 8:45 in a gray state vehicle, 20 minutes before Marcus pulled into the farmhouse drive. She was 62, compact and precise, with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years doing work that required patience and could not be hurried. She introduced herself with a handshake that was brisk without being unfriendly, set a case of equipment on the kitchen table, and asked Roy 3 questions in rapid succession about the climate conditions in the chamber, the approximate dates on the canvas-wrapped items, and whether any of the wrapping materials had been disturbed since the original discovery. Roy answered all 3. She nodded at each answer the way people nodded when their assumptions were confirmed rather than when they were receiving new information. Harold Eckert arrived 5 minutes later. Patrice Olson was behind him, with the camera from the previous day. Gerald Oates, who had not been formally invited but whose truck appeared in the drive at 9:10 with the precision of someone who understood timing, nodded to everyone and said nothing. Marcus got out of the rental car and shook Roy's hand, which was the greeting they had always used as the version of an embrace that both of them were more comfortable with, and stood in the farmhouse drive looking out at the bottom 80 in the morning light. "It looks the same," Marcus said. "It is the same," Roy said. "That's the point." They drove out to the field in 2 trucks. The morning was clear and cold with a wind out of the northwest that bent the wheat stubble in long, slow waves. Roy opened the hatch and went down first, then Harold, then Carla with her equipment case, then Marcus, then Gerald and Patrice. They descended in single file and gathered in the vestibule and then passed through the steel door into the chamber. Marcus stood just inside the doorway and looked at it the way people looked at things that exceeded what they had been told to expect. Roy had described the chamber on the phone. He had described the shelving and the containers and the dating going back to 1891 and Emmett's journal. Marcus had listened carefully and asked good questions. None of it had fully prepared him for the physical fact of standing in a 131-year-old underground vault below his family's wheat field and seeing the scope of what one man had built and what 4 subsequent generations had maintained. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He built this before he built the house." "Before the barn too," Roy said. "Before anything permanent." Marcus looked at his father. Roy could see him rearranging things in his mind, the way a person rearranged furniture in a room they had thought they understood. Carla had already crossed to the shelving units and was examining labels with a loupe, moving methodically along the first unit with the focus of someone who had found what she came for and was now working. She photographed the original oilcloth wrappings on the oldest containers and made notes in a small spiral pad. She moved to the framed document on the left wall and read it twice, then wrote for a full minute without stopping. Then she went to the back section. She stood in front of the 4 canvas-wrapped items for a longer time than she had stood in front of anything else. She crouched and examined the label on the nearest one, both the original 1924 label and the 2019 tag, without touching either. She photographed both from 3 different angles. She pressed 2 fingers gently against the canvas of the nearest item and held them there for a moment. "Good canvas," she said. "Treated. Someone knew what they were doing in 1924. She looked at the 2019 tag again. And someone knew what they were doing in 2019 too. She stood and looked at Roy. "You haven't opened any of these." "No." "Good." She opened her equipment case and took out cotton gloves, a set of specialty tools, a flat-nosed plier for the rope ties, and a shallow tray lined with acid-free material. "I want to do this one at a time. The rope is probably degraded. I'll cut it rather than try to untie it. Once the canvas is back, we assess the condition before we go further." She looked at Harold. I need photographs of each step. Nothing gets moved without being documented first. Harold nodded to Patrice. Carla began with the nearest item, the one labeled maps and survey instruments. Original field surveys 1888 to 1923. Mineral documentation. She cut the rope with a blade from her kit, the fibers coming apart easily, dry and brittle from a century in place. She folded the canvas back in sections, working from the outside edge inward. And as each section came back, Roy leaned closer and felt the specific tension of standing at the edge of something he could not see the bottom of yet. Inside the canvas was a wooden crate, its slats fitted tightly and sealed with a material that Carla identified as pine tar, applied at the joints to prevent moisture intrusion. The workmanship was careful. Emmett, or whoever had packed this in 1924, had understood something about long-term preservation that not everyone in 1924 had understood. Carla worked the slats apart with practiced precision. Inside the crate were flat items in individual protective sleeves, each sleeve made from oilcloth with sealed edges, stacked horizontally in the crate with thin wooden separators between each one. Carla lifted the top sleeve and set it in the tray and opened it at the seam. A map, large format, hand-drawn in ink on heavy paper, the lines precise and the annotations clear. The date in the lower right corner was September 1888. The title read, Original Survey, Section 14, Township 32 South, Range 28 West, Meade County, Kansas Territory. Below the title, a surveyor's name and seal. Roy recognized the section number. It was his land. Carla did not touch the map itself. She held her flashlight at an angle to the surface and moved it slowly across the paper. This is in excellent condition, she said, in the flat tone of someone who was surprised but would not perform the surprise. The pine tar did its job. She photographed it in sections, then lifted the next sleeve. The second map was dated 1890. The third was 1892. Each one showed the same section of land with accumulating detail as the surveys progressed. Emmett had been thorough. He had documented his property through multiple official surveys during the first years of his homestead, building a record of the land's characteristics that went far beyond what any homesteader was legally required to do. The seventh sleeve held something different. Not a map, but a document, 3 pages in length, the header bearing the seal of the United States General Land Office. The date was November 4th, 1889. The title read, Certificate of Mineral Rights, Homestead Entry Number 4471, Callahan, Emmett J. Roy read the document over Carla's shoulder. It was the original certificate establishing the Callahan family's ownership of all mineral rights associated with the 512 acres of their homestead claim. It was specific and comprehensive, written in the legal language of the era, and it covered subsurface rights to all depths and all formations. Roy had never seen this document. He had never known it existed. The copy of the homestead patent his father had kept in the office file drawer had not included it, because the mineral rights certificate was a separate document, issued separately, and filed separately in the original land office records. Filed and then, Roy understood, at some point removed from those records, or overlooked, or buried. He stood looking at the original certificate in Carla's tray and felt something that was not triumph and was not relief, but was the specific sensation of a long-standing wrongness resolving itself into the clarity of a fact. The rights were real. They had always been real. They had been documented since 1889, and Emmett had known they needed protecting and had preserved the original certificate in a sealed crate in a pine tar sealed wooden sleeve in a climate-controlled underground chamber for 135 years. Carla moved to the next sleeve. The following 2 hours produced a systematic account of what Emmett had gathered and what it meant. The survey maps continued through 1923, each one adding geological notations that grew more specific as the century advanced: subsurface formations, limestone depth markers, water table measurements, and, beginning in 1912, annotations that Roy did not recognize but that Carla identified, without hesitation, as early notation for natural gas indicators. Someone with geological knowledge had been looking at this property since at least 1912 and making careful notes about what was below the surface. The last sleeve in the first crate held a letter. The letterhead was the United States Geological Survey, dated March 7, 1924. It was addressed to Emmett James Callahan personally and signed by a named government geologist. Roy read the letter. The geologist had written to inform Emmett that a survey of the subsurface formations in southwestern Meade County, conducted by the USGS the previous year, had confirmed the presence of natural gas reserves beneath several homestead properties in the region, including Emmett's. He had written that the reserves were significant by the standards of the period. He had also written, in language that chose its words carefully, that Emmett's documented mineral rights gave him a strong legal position regarding those reserves, but that this position would only hold if the original documentation remained intact and accessible, because there were parties with interest in the region who had demonstrated, in his experience, a willingness to challenge the original homestead mineral grants if the documentation supporting them could not be produced. He had written, "Keep the originals safe, Mr. Callahan. The copies held by the county will not be enough." Roy lowered the letter and looked at Gerald, who was standing to his right and had been reading alongside him. Gerald said nothing. He pressed his lips together and looked at the crate. Harold was very still on Roy's left. Emmett had received that letter in 1924. He had packed the original documentation into a sealed crate and put it in the chamber that same year. And then he had died in 1931 without being able to tell anyone except a 10-year-old boy in a sick room that the ground kept what you gave it. Roy looked at the second and third and fourth canvas-wrapped items against the wall. Carla was already moving toward the second one. He looked at Marcus, who was standing near the chamber entrance and had been reading the letter over Roy's shoulder. Marcus's face was pale in the flashlight beams. Not with shock exactly, but with the expression of someone absorbing a version of history they had not known existed and reconciling it with the version they had held until this morning. "How long has this been sitting here?" Marcus said. "Since 1924, Roy said, while someone was trying to get to it. Roy looked at his son. "For a long time," he said. "Yes." The second crate held more survey materials and a set of the original geological instruments Emmett had used in his surveys, carefully packed and labeled. The third held a document Roy had been expecting since Harold's call the previous evening. It was a deed of transfer dated June 14, 1967. It transferred the mineral rights to the Callahan homestead acreage from Roy's grandfather, Howard Eugene Callahan, to a holding company called Midwest Agricultural Resources Incorporated for consideration of $1,200 and other valuable considerations. $1,200. Roy looked at it for a long moment. His grandfather had been 66 years old in 1967. He had known the chamber was there and had maintained it for decades after Emmett died. He had known the mineral rights certificate was in the chamber, and he had signed a deed transferring those rights for $1,200. Roy set the document down in the tray and straightened up and thought about that. Carla was reading a second document from the same crate, attached to the deed. She read it twice and then looked up at Harold. "This deed references the mineral rights as having been previously transferred in 1958, she said. "There's a prior transfer listed here as the legal basis for this 1967 transaction." Harold leaned in and read it. "There was number 1958 transfer," Harold said. He said it flatly, without drama, the way he said things he was certain of. He looked at Roy. "I would know about that. That would be in the county records." He paused. "It isn't." Roy looked at the 1967 deed. He thought about his grandfather at 66 years old signing a document that referenced a 1958 transaction that had never happened, transferring rights for $1,200 that had been documented since 1889 and confirmed significant by a government geologist in 1924. He thought about what a 66-year-old farmer in 1967 knew about legal documents and mineral rights transfers and fabricated prior transactions. He thought about what it would take to convince a man like Howard Callahan that a piece of paper was legitimate when it was not. "He didn't know," Roy said. "He couldn't have known," Marcus said from behind him. "Not if he maintained the chamber all those years. Not if he cared enough about those documents to keep adding to the collection. He didn't know the deed was fraudulent." "He probably didn't even know what he was signing over," Gerald said. $1,200 in 1967 for rights he may have been told were marginal or worthless. Harold was already on his phone, his voice low and precise. Roy caught the words 1967 deed and no prior 1958 transfer in the county record, and "I need the full chain of title on those mineral rights going back to 1889, before Harold moved toward the entrance and his voice became too quiet to follow. Roy looked at the 1967 deed for the last time. Then he looked at the original 1889 mineral rights certificate in Carla's tray, sitting beside the government geologist's 1924 letter and the chain of survey maps and the pine tar sealed wooden crate that Emmett had packed with the specific patience of a man who understood that what he was protecting would need to last longer than he would. He had been right. Roy turned to his son. "Call Patricia," he said. "Tell her we found the deed." While Marcus made the call and Harold continued his own, Carla finished her examination of the fourth crate. It held the original county assessor's records for the Callahan property from 1889 through 1931, the complete set, copied by hand by someone, Roy suspected by Emmett himself, as a second archive against the loss of the county copies. Each year's assessment, recorded and preserved. 42 years of documentation. The person who had done this had understood something essential. Official records disappeared. Fire and flood and deliberate removal all happened. The only true protection for a record was the existence of a copy that lived outside the official system in the hands of someone who would protect it. Emmett had understood this in 1892 when he built the chamber. The government geologist had told him explicitly in 1924, and someone had understood it well enough in 2019 to come back and leave a warning. Harold came back through the door. "Patricia's been in contact with the county recorder's office since yesterday," he said. "There is no recorded 1958 mineral rights transfer in Meade County. The 1967 deed references a transaction that, as far as the official record shows, never took place." He paused. "Patricia's filing this morning." Roy nodded. Carla was packing her equipment with the organized efficiency she had brought to everything. She closed the equipment case and looked at Roy with the straightforward expression of someone who had seen a great many historical discoveries in 40 years and had developed a considered view of what they meant. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "the documentation in these crates is complete and in extraordinary condition. The original mineral rights certificate from 1889, combined with the 1924 USGS survey letter and the absence of a legitimate prior transfer in the official record, establishes a clear chain of title to the original rights." She paused. "I want to be careful not to say things that are outside my professional lane. But I can tell you that in my experience, documentation of this completeness and authenticity is unusual." Emmett Callahan preserved his family's position extremely well. Roy looked at the crates. "He just needed someone to find it," he said. Carla picked up her equipment case. "Yes," she said. "He did. It was Harold who found out about Hazel. He did it the way he did most things, quietly and without announcement. And the call came to Roy that evening while Marcus was making dinner in the farmhouse kitchen and Roy was sitting at the table with the journal again. Harold had identified the handwriting on the 2019 labels. He had run it through a comparison against several documents and traced it, through a process Roy did not fully understand but did not need to a woman named Hazel Merritt, born Hazel Pauline Callahan in 1921. Emmett's granddaughter, Roy's grandfather's younger sister. Roy had known Hazel existed, in the abstract way that one knew about elderly relatives in distant towns. She had moved to Dodge City when she married in the 1940s. Roy had met her perhaps 4 times in his life, most recently at his father's funeral 31 years ago, when she had been an elderly woman in a dark dress who had held Roy's hand at the graveside and said something he had not quite heard over the wind. She was living in a care facility in Dodge City now, 99 years old, and Harold had confirmed she was mentally present and had been asked to expect Roy's visit. Roy drove to Dodge City the following morning. The facility was a low brick building on the west side of town with a well-kept entrance and a staff member who walked Roy to Hazel's room without the skeptical delay he had half expected. Hazel Merritt was sitting in a chair by the window with a wool blanket across her lap, an afternoon light coming in at an angle that caught the silver of her hair. She was small and thin in the way of very old people, her face deeply lined, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of attention. But her eyes, when she looked at Roy as he came through the door, were clear and specific and recognized him immediately. "You found it," she said. Roy sat in the chair across from her. "I found it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You look like your father," she said. He had the same way of sitting, like he was prepared to wait as long as necessary. "He was," Roy said. Hazel turned her face toward the window. I went down in 2019, she said. My granddaughter drove me out. I didn't tell her why. She thought I was going to say goodbye to the farm. She paused, which was true in a way. Roy waited. I had been watching the records requests, she said. I knew how to look for them because my brother Howard taught me how. He told me years ago, before he died, that I should keep an eye on any filings related to the property. He knew people were interested. He knew the transfer in 1967 was wrong, eventually. She turned back to Roy. He understood it too late. Roy thought about his grandfather signing the deed at 66. What happened in 1967? Hazel's expression did not change, but something in it settled into a different arrangement. A man came to the farm in the spring of that year. He had papers. He told your grandfather that the county had discovered an irregularity in the original Homestead patent, that the mineral rights had actually been held by a territorial claim that predated the homestead, and that Howard owed a substantial sum for the use of rights he had not legitimately owned. He offered to settle the matter for $1,200 and a transfer of the rights. Your grandfather was 66 and had no lawyer and did not understand what he was signing. I was not there. I was in Dodge City. She paused. I found out 6 months later when Howard wrote to me. By then the papers were filed. Did you try to challenge it? We had an attorney look at it in 1969. The attorney said the recorded chain of title appeared legitimate and that without the original documentation from the homestead period, the challenge would not succeed. She looked at Roy steadily. We had the original documentation, but producing it would have required revealing the chamber, which Howard was not willing to do, because the chamber held things that did not belong only to us. Roy thought about the people Emmett had been custodian for, the families who had entrusted him with their irreplaceable things. Some of those families' descendants, wherever they were, still had a claim to what was in those containers. So you kept it hidden, Roy said. Howard kept it hidden until he died. Then I kept it hidden. She folded her hands more tightly in her lap. I have been going out to the farm every few years since 1973. My husband drove me when he was alive. My son drove me after that. My granddaughter in 2019. She paused. I rewrapped items that needed it. I updated the labels when the older ones became difficult to read. I watched the chamber. She turned to look at Roy again. I always expected it would be Roy who found it. Your father didn't have your patience, and your grandfather ran out of time. But I watched you, the years you held on when Howard's farm would have been an easier choice, and I thought, that boy has Emmett in him. He'll stay. Roy sat with that for a moment. You should have told me, he said. Yes, she said, without argument or apology. I should have. I was afraid. Afraid that once it was known, it would be taken. And I was old, and I told myself the right moment would announce itself. She looked at her hands. I suppose it did. Roy drove back to the farm with the window down despite the cold, the flat country moving past him in the late afternoon, the sky going orange at the edges. He called Patricia from the road. Hazel Merritt, he said, Emmett's granddaughter. She's been the secondary custodian of the chamber since 1973. She can testify to the continuous family maintenance of the space and to the conversation with her brother Howard about the 1967 transfer. Patricia was quiet for 2 seconds. How old is she? 99. Sharp. Can she give a deposition? She can give anything you need from her. She's been waiting 50 years to give it. Patricia said, Roy, we have the 1889 mineral rights certificate, the 1924 USGS letter, the absence of a legitimate 1958 prior transfer in the county record, and now a direct witness to the fraudulent inducement of the 1967 deed. The chain of title to those mineral rights is intact. The 1967 transfer is challengeable on multiple grounds. A pause. And the 2011 geological test. The firm that commissioned it is the same firm connected to HCM Land Holdings. If we can establish that the test was commissioned to produce a specific result, that is a separate and significant problem for Mr. Holt. Roy pulled into the farm drive. Marcus was on the porch. Gerald's truck was still there. What does this mean in numbers? Roy said. Patricia did not answer immediately, which he had come to understand meant she had an answer and was deciding how to frame it. The Hugoton Formation gas production in Meade County since the 1920s has generated significant documented royalties. Properties with continuous, documented mineral rights from the Homestead period have established claims in prior litigation. A conservative assessment of past royalty income on production from a property of your acreage and location would be in the range of $40 to $60 million. She paused. That is the past royalties claim alone. The current value of the undeveloped rights, given production activity in adjacent properties, would be assessed separately. Roy sat in the drive with the truck engine idling. And the collection, he said. The chamber. The collection is a separate matter and a different type of value. Carla Hutchings has indicated she will prepare a preliminary assessment. Based on what she saw, she believes the monetary value of the collection, including the numismatic items, the original documents, and the historical survey materials, is likely to be assessed in the range of $8 to $12 million. A pause. But Mr. Callahan, that number does not account for the cultural and historical value of materials that belong to other families in this county. Emmett was a custodian. Some of what is in those containers will need to be returned to the families it came from, where those families can be identified. Roy turned off the engine. I know, he said. Dale Holt's attorney arrived at the farm 3 days later. He was a man named Garrison Wells from the Wichita firm, accompanied by a second attorney Roy did not recognize. Patricia was there. Harold was there. Roy stood on the porch and watched them get out of the car and understood, from the way they walked toward the house, that they had not come to settle. They had come to see if there was still a position they could defend. Patricia handled the meeting in the farmhouse living room with the precise, contained authority of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for several days and had prepared for it at length. She laid out the documentation in order: the 1889 mineral rights certificate, the 1924 USGS letter, the absence of the 1958 prior transfer in the county record, Hazel Merritt's statement, and the connections between the firms involved in the 1967 transfer and the entities that had filed records requests on the property and commissioned the 2011 geological test. Garrison Wells listened with the practiced attentiveness of a man who was paid to appear unimpressed. His colleague took notes. When Patricia finished, Wells asked 3 questions, each of which Patricia answered with a document in hand. Then Wells was quiet for a moment. Mr. Holt's position has always been that he was interested in the property for agricultural purposes, Wells said. Mr. Holt's position is welcome in court, Patricia said, where it will be examined alongside the 11 records requests, the geological survey company registered by his brother-in-law, and the 2011 test commissioned by a firm connected to his holding company at the same time his company began filing records requests on the Callahan property. Another silence. My client is prepared to discuss a settlement, Wells said. Your client is prepared to discuss a settlement. Patricia repeated, without inflection, the way she repeated things she intended to let sit in the air for a moment. Let me tell you what a settlement will require, Mr. Wells. A full accounting of every piece of information your client's organizations gathered about this property. A statement acknowledging the connection between the 1967 transfer and your client's interests. And a figure for damages that reflects 60 years of suppressed mineral rights, not $1,200 and a handshake. Wells looked at Roy. Roy looked back at him. Mr. Callahan, Wells said, I think there may be more room for conversation here than Mr. Wells, Roy said. He said it without heat and without hurry. My great-great-grandfather built a chamber in this ground in 1892 and spent 40 years filling it, and he trusted it to this family. And this family kept it for 130 years. Every person who told me to sell, every offer I turned down, every year I held on when the numbers said I should give up, all of it was right. Not because I knew why, because this land was worth keeping. He looked at the attorney. Tell your client the answer is whatever Patricia says it is. Wells and his colleague left an hour later. Patricia walked them to their car and came back inside and told Roy and Marcus and Harold that she expected a serious settlement offer within 2 weeks. 2 weeks became 10 days. The settlement amount was not announced publicly at Patricia's recommendation and Roy's agreement, because some of the connected litigation involving the fraudulent 1967 deed and the 2011 geological assessment was ongoing. But the number was substantial, and Roy understood it. And when Marcus did the calculations on a legal pad at the kitchen table and wrote the final figure and turned the pad toward Roy, Roy looked at it for a long moment and then looked at his son and said, Your grandfather would not have known what to say. Marcus said, I don't know what to say. Roy said, Emmett would have. Phil Strachan, Roy's accountant, called the following week. He had seen the news coverage, which had been brief but present, a regional story about a mineral rights dispute settled in favor of a Meade County family farm. Phil was careful and professional on the call, the way he was always careful and professional, and at the end of it he said that he owed Roy an apology. "You told me it was irrational to hold on," Roy said. "I did," Phil said. "I was wrong." Roy told him he appreciated the call and meant it. Carla Baines at Farmers and Merchants Bank called 2 days after Phil. The loan that had sat in the unresolved column of Roy's life for years was a different kind of conversation now. Carla was gracious and warm, and Roy accepted the warmth without rancor, because he was not built for rancor and because the satisfaction he felt did not require anyone else to feel worse. Gerald Oates, who had been on the bottom 80 the morning it all started and had been there for every significant moment since, said nothing when Roy told him the settlement number except to make the sound he had made when he first stepped into the chamber, a sound that was not quite a word. Jeff Gaines, who had told Roy at the Millstone Bar that there was no shame in knowing when something was over, called on a Thursday evening and said he had followed the news and was genuinely glad, and that he had been wrong to say what he said, and Roy said that Jeff had not been wrong exactly, that from where Jeff was standing it was a reasonable thing to say, and that sometimes the difference between quitting and holding on was information you did not have yet. Jeff said that was generous. Roy said it was accurate. Marcus stayed for 3 weeks, which was the longest stretch he had spent at the farm since leaving for college. He worked alongside Roy on the things that always needed doing in spring on a working operation, the equipment maintenance and the soil preparation and the slow physical labor of a farm getting ready for another season. He had his laptop and his phone and conducted his Denver work in the early mornings and the evenings, but the hours between were different from any hours they had shared since Marcus was a boy. One afternoon toward the end of his stay, they walked the bottom 80 together. The weather had warmed, and the field smelled of turned earth and the particular mineral scent of wet Kansas soil in spring. The disturbed patch above the hatch had weathered back to ordinary-looking ground, the marks of the excavation smoothed by 2 weeks of rain and wind. Marcus walked beside Roy in silence for a while, and then said, "I want to understand what happens now with the collection." Roy had been thinking about this since the day he had sat in Emmett's chamber and read about the families who had trusted their irreplaceable things to a farmer with a reputation for straightness. "Carla is working on an inventory," Roy said. "She'll identify every item and its probable origin. For the things that came from other families, we try to find descendants. Some of it goes back." He paused. "What's left, what genuinely belongs to the Callahan family, and what had nowhere else to go, we make available. Not in a museum somewhere else. Here, on this land." Marcus looked at him. "A facility on the property," Roy said. "Climate-controlled. Accessible to researchers and schools and anyone who wants to understand what this county looked like in the first 40 years of settlement. What people brought to it, and what it asked of them, and what they did when it asked too much." He looked at the field. Emmett didn't build that chamber to hide things permanently. He built it to protect things until they could be shared safely. We're at the safely part now. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That would take planning," he said. "It would. And funding. We have funding." Marcus looked at his father, and Roy saw him working through something. The specific calculation of a man deciding how much of a decision he had already made before he had finished making it. "I could work remotely," Marcus said. "For a while." Roy looked at the bottom 80. He did not say anything. He had learned a long time ago that certain things were better met with silence than with response, because response could close off possibilities that silence left open. They walked the rest of the field without speaking, the early spring sun low and warm on the stubble. Roy went back to the chamber the evening before Marcus flew home. He went alone, in the hour before dark, and climbed down the shaft and walked through the vestibule and into the space Emmett had built and filled across a lifetime, and stood in the center of it with a flashlight. The inventory was complete. Carla and 2 colleagues from the State Historical Society had spent a week documenting every item. The collection ran to 273 catalog pieces, not counting the survey materials and instruments in the back section. Gold coins totaling approximately 482 pieces from multiple eras. Land documents from 47 separate families in the county's early settlement period. Letters, diaries, instruments, a pressed wildflower collection from a woman named Agnes Hargrove who had died in the winter of 1894, whose family had asked Emmett to hold it when they fled their homestead in the drought. A child's drawing, framed and preserved. The paper a century old, the crayon marks still clear, the name written in a child's hand at the bottom. Lucy, 1896. Roy stood in the center of the chamber and turned the flashlight slowly over the shelves. He thought about Emmett at 26 with a team of horses and a second-hand plow, finding a cavity in the limestone and understanding immediately what it was for. He thought about Agnes at Emmett's side, helping design the shelving, agreeing it was right. He thought about Roy's grandfather at 10 years old in a sick room, listening to an old man say the only thing he could safely say. The ground keeps what you give it. He thought about Hazel at 68 driving out to the farm in 1989 to rewrap items and update labels, and at 93 in 2015 making another trip, and at 97 in 2019 with her granddaughter at the wheel, coming one last time to read the warning and know she had done what she could. He thought about Linda, who would have known what to say about all of it and who was not here to say it, and he let himself feel that absence the way he felt it sometimes. Not with the sharp edge it had carried in the early years, but with the particular weight of a thing that had become part of the structure of his life. He thought about 31 years on this land. Every spring planting and fall harvest and winter maintenance. Every decision to hold on when the numbers said otherwise. Every conversation with every well-meaning person who had told him there was no shame in knowing when something was over. He had not known about the chamber. He had not held on because he knew what was in the ground. He had held on because the ground felt worth holding, because the bottom 80 had a quality of presence that he had never been able to explain and had stopped trying to explain and had simply trusted. That was the thing about Emmett. He had not told anyone explicitly, in all those years of entries and preparations and careful labeling. He had not left instructions that said, here is the chamber, here is what it contains, here is what you need to do. He had left one sentence in the memory of a 10-year-old boy and had trusted that sentence to find the right person at the right time. Roy turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark for a moment. Outside, above the 12 feet of Kansas earth, the bottom 80 was settling into evening. The wheat he had planted in October was in the ground, dormant now but present, waiting for the warmth and the moisture that would bring it up in the spring. It would come up the same as it always had, better per acre than any comparable section. The soil holding its moisture longer and releasing it slower in a way the soil scientists had never fully explained. Roy had a theory about that now. Emmett had put something in this ground. He had put care in it and attention and 100 years of human trust and the specific gravity of things that mattered enough to preserve. He had put the future in it, not knowing who the future would be, only trusting that someone would come who deserved what he had kept. The ground had held it. Roy climbed the shaft in the dark, hand over hand on the iron rungs that Emmett had set in 1892 and that 130 years of careful maintenance had kept solid. He came up into the evening air and stood beside the closed hatch and looked at the field. Tomorrow there were calls to make and documents to review and plans to begin building toward the thing that the chamber would become. The facility Roy intended to build would take a year to design and another to construct, and the process of identifying the families of the items Emmett had kept for others would take longer than that, and the legal proceedings connected to the 1967 deed would run their course on their own timeline with Harold and Patricia attending to them. There was a great deal of work ahead. Roy looked at the bottom 80 in the last of the light and felt what he had come to feel in this field his entire life, heavier now with the weight of what he knew, but still there. Still the same quality of presence that had brought him out here in the early mornings for 31 years before he knew why. Emmett had understood this ground. He had built something in it that outlasted him by more than a century and had waited for the right hands to open it. He had trusted a sentence to carry a secret across 3 generations, and it had carried it, intact, all the way to a 58-year-old farmer who could not explain why he held on, but could not bring himself to let go. Roy had been the right person. Not because he was the most qualified or the most prepared or the most knowledgeable about what he was protecting. Because he had stayed. Because every year he had chosen this field over every alternative. For reasons that no accountant or banker or well-meaning neighbor could have measured. And the choice had been right in a way that the world had simply not yet had the information to confirm. He walked back to the truck in the dark. The farmhouse porch light was on, the way it was always on when he came back from the field late. Marcus had put it on. Roy looked at it across the field and kept walking toward it. Behind him, below the surface of the bottom 80, Emmett's chamber sat in its controlled dark, the shelves documented and the inventory complete and the items prepared for the next chapter of their keeping. The channel of care that had run from Emmett to Agnes to Howard to Hazel to the present had found its continuation, and what had been hidden for 131 years was about to become what it had always been meant to be. Available, shared, alive in the world where it could do what Emmett had gathered it to do. The ground had given back what it was given. It always did. Roy started visiting Hazel every Thursday. The drive from the farm to Dodge City took 40 minutes on a clear day, 60 when the weather was doing something, and Roy had made it enough times in his life that the route had the quality of an old habit, the road unfolding without requiring much conscious attention. He used the drive to think, the way he used the tractor for the same purpose, moving through familiar country while the mind worked at whatever it was working at. The first Thursday visit had been for practical reasons. Carla Hutchings needed Hazel's formal recollections about the chamber, specifically the dates of her visits and the condition of the collection at each one, and rather than asking an elderly woman to submit a written statement, Roy had offered to serve as the intermediary. He had expected to make 3 or 4 visits at most, enough to gather what Patricia and Carla needed, and then to maintain occasional contact out of courtesy. The visits had continued on their own momentum after that. Hazel had a store of information about the Callahan family's history that no document in the chamber had captured, the living memory of a woman who had been 10 years old when Emmett died and who had known Roy's grandfather, Roy's father, and the farm itself across a span of nearly 90 years. Each Thursday, she was waiting in the chair by the window when Roy arrived, the wool blanket across her lap, and each time she told him something he had not known before. She told him about the man who had come to the farm in 1967 with the fraudulent documents about the mineral rights transfer. His name was Vernon Lyle, and he had been employed by a company called Central Plains Resource Partners, which was itself a subsidiary of a larger oil and gas holding company based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Harold Eckert had already found most of this through his investigation, but Hazel remembered Lyle specifically because Howard had described him to her in a letter written the following week, the letter in which he had first told her what he had signed. Howard had written that Lyle was a well-dressed man who spoke with confidence and carried papers that looked official and explained things in a way that made them sound like established facts rather than arguments. He had told Howard that the matter was straightforward, that the county had identified an irregularity, and that Howard had 2 options: pay the back assessment that would be levied on rights improperly held, or sign the transfer and the matter would be closed. Howard had signed the transfer. Hazel told Roy this with the expression of someone who had lived for 55 years with a knowledge she could not act on, a slow burn of helplessness that had become part of the furniture of her thinking. He trusted paper, she said. Your grandfather trusted official-looking paper. That was the world he came from. When a man came to your door with a government seal on his documents, you assumed the government sent him. Did he ever talk about it after that? Roy said. Hazel looked at the window. He talked about it once. He said he had made a mistake and that he hoped the record would correct itself someday. He was not a man who explained himself at length. She paused. You are like him. That way. Roy drove home from that Thursday with the particular sensation he sometimes felt after these visits, the sense of a picture becoming more detailed, the shapes that had been blurry at the edges sharpening into specifics. Lyle had worked for Central Plains Resource Partners. Central Plains had been dissolved in 1978. Its assets and records had been absorbed by another company, and that company's assets had been further consolidated through a series of transactions over the subsequent decades that Patricia's team was still tracing. At the end of that chain, somewhere, was the entity that held the fraudulently obtained mineral rights, and at some point in the last 30 years, someone in that chain had understood what they held and what it was worth and had begun the coordinated process of securing the position before anyone else could find the original documentation. That part of the story was still resolving itself through the legal process. Roy followed it at the pace Patricia reported it to him, and otherwise tried not to think about it too much, because thinking about things he could not accelerate was a habit he had learned to interrupt. The Lucy drawing took 3 months to trace. Carla had found it in the 4th container on the left wall of the chamber, the one she had opened on the 3rd day of her inventory work. It was framed in plain wood, the frame handmade with simple miter joints, the kind of frame a farmer built in a spare hour in the workshop rather than buying in town. Behind the glass was a sheet of heavy paper covered in crayon marks, the drawing of a house and a tree and what appeared to be a horse, executed in the direct, confident style of a child who knew what she saw and set it down without hesitation. At the bottom right of the drawing, in pencil, in a different hand from the child's, someone had written, Lucy, age 7, spring 1896. There was no family name, no additional information. The label on the outside of the container identified it only by date, 1896, with the designation personal effects. One family. No further notation. Carla went back to the county records for 1896, looking for a family with a child named Lucy, 7 years old, who had been in the area during the spring of that year and who had likely left the county at some point during the drought years of the late 1890s. The county records for that period were incomplete, as records from that era in that part of Kansas tended to be, but she found a family named Stoddard, Henry and Clara Stoddard, who had filed a homestead claim in 1893 and whose claim had been abandoned, according to the county's records, in 1899. A daughter, Lucille, was listed in the 1895 county tax assessment. Lucille, who called herself Lucy, 7 years old in 1896. The Stoddards had left during the drought, which matched what Emmett had recorded in the journal about families departing and leaving items in his keeping during that period. The Stoddard family had gone to Missouri. That was all the local record showed. Carla had colleagues at the Missouri Historical Society, and the trail had moved east through census records and church records and the particular patience of people who spent their professional lives following these threads. Henry and Clara Stoddard had settled in Jasper County, Missouri, in 1900. They had 2 daughters, Lucille and a younger girl named Frances, who had been born in Missouri. Lucille had married in 1912. She had 3 children. Those children had children, and those children had children, and by the time the tracing was complete, there were 11 living descendants of Henry and Clara Stoddard spread across Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Roy drove to Joplin, Missouri on a Thursday in early July, which meant he moved his visit to Hazel to the following week. He brought Carla and the drawing, which had been carefully cleaned and remounted by a conservator at the State Historical Society. He also brought a letter from Patricia explaining the legal basis for the return and documenting the chain of custody. The Stoddard descendants had been contacted in advance and had gathered at a cousin's house in Joplin, 11 people ranging in age from 22 to 78. Roy had not known what to expect. He had not been able to imagine it with any accuracy. Standing in a stranger's living room holding a framed crayon drawing made by a 7-year-old girl in the spring of 1896 was not something he had a prior experience to compare it to. The oldest person in the room was a woman named Carolyn, 78, who had known about the drawing from a story her grandmother had told her. Her grandmother, Lucy's youngest daughter, had been told the story by Lucy herself in the 1950s, that when the family left Kansas in 1899, they had left a few things with a neighbor for safekeeping, because the wagon was too full and the items were too fragile for the journey, and that they had always meant to go back for them. Lucy had died in 1971 without going back. Carolyn held the framed drawing in her lap and did not speak for a long time. Her son, who was standing behind her chair, put his hand on her shoulder. Roy looked at the drawing from across the room. A house, a tree, a horse, crayon marks on heavy paper, 128 years old, preserved in pine tar and oilcloth in an underground chamber below a Kansas wheat field, waiting for the family it belonged to. Carolyn looked up at Roy eventually. "How did it stay so clear?" she said. "Emmett Callahan took care of it," Roy said. "He took care of everything." She thanked him. Roy drove home in the long July evening and did not try to put language to what the drive felt like. The Agnes Hargrove pressed wildflower collection had a harder path. Agnes Hargrove had died in the winter of 1894, which Emmett had recorded in the journal with the specific notation that her family had left the pressed flower album in his keeping in the fall of 1893 when they fled their homestead during the drought, and that Agnes had died of fever before the family could establish itself elsewhere. The family had sent word from Colorado, Emmett wrote, asking him to hold the album until they were settled enough to receive it. The next entry that mentioned the Hargrove family was from 1897, noting that he had sent a letter to an address in Colorado and received it back undelivered. After that, nothing. The family had disappeared into the ordinary opacity of the late 19th century. No forwarding address, no census record Carla could find under that name in Colorado or anywhere else. No trail that her colleagues could pick up from what survived. Roy held the album in his hands one afternoon in the chamber and looked at the flowers pressed between the pages. The colors had faded to soft browns and golds and faint greens, the shapes still clear, each one placed with evident care and labeled in a woman's careful script with the common name and the date and the location of finding. Wild bergamot, June 14, 1891, East Creek Bank. Prairie clover, August 3, 1891, Southfield Edge. Goldenrod, September 12, 1891, along the fence. Agnes Hargrove had been building something. A record of the beautiful things on the land she was trying to make a home on. She had not lived long enough to fill the album past the first 40 pages. Roy returned the album to the chamber. Not every item could be returned. Some things had belonged to people who were entirely gone, whose families had scattered beyond the reach of any record that still existed. For those items, the facility Roy was building would be their home, where they would be accessible to anyone who came looking, permanently available rather than permanently hidden. This was the thing Roy had spent the most time thinking about in the months since the discovery, the difference between protecting something and hiding it. Emmett had understood the distinction. The chamber had never been meant as a permanent solution. It was a bridge across a dangerous period, a place to keep things safe until the world was safe enough to share them. The world had taken longer to get there than Emmett had perhaps expected, but it had gotten there. The legal proceedings involving the 1967 mineral rights transfer concluded in November of the following year. The details were the subject of extended confidentiality agreements that Roy had signed at Patricia's recommendation and would not discuss in specific terms, but the outcome was this. The rights were restored to the Callahan family in full, with a settlement covering the period of improper alienation, and 3 individuals connected to the chain of entities that had managed and exploited those rights faced separate regulatory proceedings in the oil and gas industry. Dale Holt did not face criminal charges. Patricia had been direct about the likelihood of that outcome from an early stage. The distance between his organizations and the original 1967 fraud was real, even if the connections were visible, and the standard for criminal liability was a different threshold than the standard for civil damages. What Dale Holt faced was a civil judgment, a significant one, and a reputational outcome that Roy observed from a distance with no particular satisfaction. He had not wanted Dale Holt to be destroyed. He had wanted the rights returned and the record corrected, and both had happened. Gerald summed it up in the way Gerald summed up things. Some people pay in money. Some people pay in other ways. He said this at the kitchen table in the farmhouse on a November evening while Roy was reading and Marcus was on his laptop at the far end of the table, and then Gerald went back to his coffee without elaborating, which was exactly how Roy would have handled it too. Marcus had given his notice in Denver in September. He had told Roy on a Sunday evening phone call, not with the careful preparatory tone, but in the direct way he spoke when he had already made the decision and was reporting it rather than testing it. He had called his manager, he said, and worked out a transition timeline of 60 days. He was keeping some consulting work that he could do remotely, which would bring in enough income to make the transition manageable. He would be at the farm before the end of October. Roy had said. That was good news. Marcus had said he knew that Roy never said more than he meant, so he would take that as a significant statement. He arrived on a Tuesday in late October with a rental truck he had driven from Denver and 2 friends he had borrowed to help with the unloading, which turned out to be unnecessary because the truck contained 1 bedroom's worth of furniture, several boxes of books, and the particular spare accumulation of a man who had been living efficiently rather than sentimentally. The friends drove back to Denver that evening. Marcus put his things in the south bedroom, which had been his room as a child and had been a storage room for 11 years. Roy had cleared it out over the preceding weekend and put a fresh coat of paint on the walls, not mentioning either action when Marcus asked what he had been doing. They ate dinner that first evening with a quietness between them that was not awkward, but was the quietness of 2 people adjusting to a new configuration of their lives. Gerald came over after dinner, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table until 10 o'clock, which was late for all of them, talking about the facility construction and the timeline and the spring planting. And when Gerald left, Roy noticed that Marcus had tracked the whole conversation with the engaged attention of someone who was already thinking about where he fit in. Ground was broken on the Callahan Archive and Heritage Center in the first week of March, on a section of the farmstead just north of the original barn site. The architect was a woman from Wichita who had done similar work at 3 other rural heritage sites in the state, and who had spent 2 days walking the property before she submitted a design. The building she proposed was low and long, with exterior materials that echoed the farm's existing structures without trying to replicate them, and a climate-controlled interior organized around the chamber itself, which would remain in situ below the bottom 80 with a designed access route rather than the iron rungs and steel door. The connection between the surface building and the underground space was a central feature of the design rather than an afterthought. Roy stood at the edge of the marked construction area on the morning the equipment arrived and watched the first work begin and thought about Emmett in 1892 doing the same thing in reverse, working downward into the earth while the people who would eventually need what he was building did not yet know they would need it. A journalist named Kendra Park drove out from Kansas City in April, working on a piece for a national magazine. Roy had agreed to the interview after Patricia told him that the story was going to be written regardless, and that Roy's participation would be better for the record than his absence. Kendra was 36 and thorough, the kind of journalist who had done the research before the interview and was using the conversation to understand things the research had not captured. She spent a morning at the farm and an afternoon at the construction site, and then sat with Roy at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She asked about the financial settlement, which Roy declined to detail. She asked about the legal outcome for the Holt entities, which Roy described in terms Patricia had approved. She asked about the chamber and the collection and Hazel and the Stoddard family in Joplin and the Agnes Hargrove album and the facility being built. Then she asked the question Roy had been expecting, the one that most journalists eventually got to, the one about why he had held on. Roy thought about how to answer it honestly without it becoming a story with a lesson attached, because it did not have a lesson attached. It was just what had happened. I didn't know why I held on, he said. That's the accurate answer. I held on because letting go felt wrong. Because this field, he gestured toward the window, toward the bottom 80 visible in the afternoon light, felt like it was worth staying for. Not because of anything I could justify in a spreadsheet. Kendra wrote in her notebook. Did you ever doubt that feeling? Every year, Roy said. Every spring when the loan was due and the equipment needed work and the numbers didn't come out right. I doubted it the way you doubted any feeling that you couldn't explain. I just kept coming back to the same place. The feeling was there every morning when I walked the field. I couldn't make it go away, so I kept acting on it. What do you think it was? Roy considered this. Outside the kitchen window, the bottom 80 was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, holding the light longer than it should, the surface of it warmer and more present than the surrounding fields. I think Emmett put something in this ground, he said. Not just the chamber. The quality of attention he brought to it. 130 years of people caring about this specific piece of earth. That accumulates. I could feel it without knowing what it was. He paused. Or maybe that's a thing a person says after the fact to explain something that didn't need explaining while it was happening. I don't know. I just know the field always felt worth it. Kendra looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in her notebook. The piece appeared in the magazine in June and was read by a significant number of people, which Roy knew because his phone produced 3 days of calls from numbers he did not recognize and a substantial amount of correspondence directed to the farm's address. Some of it was from people with family connections to Meade County who had heard about the collection and wanted to know if their family's items might be among it. Carla's office was managing those inquiries now, with a formal process for reviewing claims and matching them against the inventory. 2 more families were identified that summer through the magazine piece. One was a family from Wichita whose great-great-grandparents had been among the families Emmett served as custodian for in the 1890s. Their claim was for a set of correspondence, business letters relating to a land transaction from the 1895 period that had sat in a sealed container labeled 1895 documents. Business. One family since before Roy was born. The letters were returned in July, and the family donated them immediately to the facility's permanent archive as a gift in their family's name, which seemed to Roy like the right outcome. The second family came from further away, a woman in Oregon who had found the magazine article and recognized the description of a carved wooden box listed in the inventory as originating from the 1900 period, Native American trade goods, provenance uncertain. She was the granddaughter of a man who had come through Kansas in the early 1900s and had left items with a farmer in Meade County while traveling west during a difficult period of his life. The description her grandfather had given, told to her mother and then to her, matched the box in the inventory closely enough that Carla had agreed to an examination. It was the right box. The granddaughter flew to Kansas in August and held it in the room that was being built to house the collection and cried with a directness that made everyone in the room look at something else for a while, the particular private grief of receiving something you had not known you were still waiting for. The facility opened in October, 14 months after the groundbreaking, on a clear fall day with the same quality of light that the bottom 80 always seemed to arrange around itself in the afternoon hours. The invitation list had been Roy's to compile, and he had kept it modest. The people who had been part of the story and the people from the county whose families had roots in the period the collection documented. Harold Eckert came. Gerald came with his wife. Patricia drove in from Dodge City with 2 colleagues. Carla Hutchings came with 3 members of her state historical society team. Hazel Merritt was transported from her care facility in a medical transport arranged by her granddaughter, and she arrived in a wheelchair with a blanket across her lap and the same clear, specific eyes that had recognized Roy the first time he walked into her room. Marcus stood at the entrance to the building and received people as they arrived with a natural ease that Roy had not expected but recognized, in retrospect, as something his son had probably been capable of for a long time without the occasion to show it. Roy walked through the facility with Hazel in the hour before the formal opening, pushing the wheelchair through rooms whose contents she had helped preserve across decades of quiet maintenance. She looked at each display with the recognition of someone seeing old friends rather than historical artifacts, and occasionally said something brief and specific about a particular item that no label could have conveyed. At the entrance to the access route that led down to the chamber, she asked Roy to stop the wheelchair. She sat looking at the doorway for a moment. He would have approved, she said. The building. The access. Making it open. She turned her head slightly toward Roy. He was not a man who wanted things hidden permanently. He was a man who wanted things safe until safe was possible. She looked back at the doorway. It took longer than he expected. But the count is right. Roy did not ask what she meant by the count. He thought he understood. A child arrived with her family during the open hour. A girl of about 8 who had been brought by her parents, who were descendants of a farming family from the county's early period. The girl moved through the displays with the focused intensity that some children brought to things that genuinely interested them, stopping in front of each case and reading the labels and pressing her face close to the glass with the complete concentration of someone who had forgotten the room around her. She stopped longest in front of the case that held the Lucy drawing. Roy watched her from across the room. The girl was looking at the house and the tree and the horse that Lucy Stoddard had drawn in the spring of 1896, at 7 years old, on a homestead in Meade County, on land her parents would lose to drought 3 years later. The girl looked at it with the absorbed attention of someone recognizing something across a long distance. Roy looked at the drawing and then at the girl and thought about what it meant for a thing to survive long enough to be seen. Not just kept, but genuinely seen, by someone with no reason to see it except that it was there, and it was true, and it was the kind of thing that deserved to be looked at. Emmett had known this about objects and had known it about people. He had trusted the latter to care for the former for as long as was needed. The chain of that trust had held across 5 generations and more than a century, through droughts and bad deals and stubborn farmers who could not explain why they stayed, and elderly women who made quiet trips to underground chambers in their 90s, and it had arrived at this room, and this building, and this girl with her face against the glass. Roy harvested the bottom 80 that June, the first harvest after everything had changed. The yield came in at 62 bushels per acre, which was the best the field had produced in Roy's 32 years of farming it, which he told Gerald without comment, and Gerald said without comment that sometimes land rewarded attention. Roy drove the combine through the southeast corner of the field on the last pass of the harvest, the pass that took the final standing wheat and left the field cut and open to the sky. And he did what he had done at the end of every harvest on this field for 32 years. He stopped the machine and sat in the quiet cab, and looked at the work that was done. The stubble lay flat in the late afternoon sun. The soil showed dark and rich below it. The hatch was somewhere to his left, unmarked and unremarkable in the surface of the field, the access route to the chamber now running through the new facility rather than through a panel in the ground. But the shaft itself still there, still intact, the iron rungs still solid in the concrete walls. He thought about Emmett coming across this same ground in the spring of 1892 with a team of horses and a plow, and finding the cavity in the limestone below the southeast corner and understanding immediately what it was for. He thought about the understanding, not the finding, which was chance, but the understanding, which was not. Emmett had known what to do with the cavity because he was already the kind of man who understood what certain things were for. The reliability that people trusted him with their irreplaceable items was the same quality that recognized, in a hole in the ground, the possibility of a vault. Roy had that quality too, though he had expressed it differently. He had expressed it by staying, year after year, in the face of all the very reasonable arguments for leaving. He had expressed it by planting a field that he could not fully explain and walking it in the early mornings and feeling in it something he had no language for. He had expressed it by saying no to every version of an offer that would have made his life easier and smaller, not because he was stubborn, though he was, but because something in him recognized that this ground was not finished with its purpose yet. Marcus came out to the combine at the end of the last pass, walking across the stubble in the way of someone who had relearned the terrain of the farm over the past year and moved through it with the ease of renewed familiarity. He climbed up to the cab door, and Roy opened it, and they sat for a moment with the cab door open and the evening cooling around them and the harvested fields spread out in all directions. Same yield as last year, Marcus said. Better, Roy said. 62. Marcus looked at the field. The facility had 400 visitors in its first month, he said. Carla says that's above projection for a rural heritage site. Roy nodded. We have a school group coming from Wichita in November, Marcus said. 40 kids. Roy said nothing. Marcus looked at the field for a while longer. Then he said, I've been thinking about what Hazel said, about the count being right. He paused. I think she meant that the number of generations it took was the right number, that it couldn't have been fewer. Roy thought about that. It took the time it took, Roy said, because each piece needed the right person in the right moment. Emmett needed to be the man who built it. Howard needed to be the man who maintained it and signed the deed and felt the weight of the mistake for the rest of his life and left it in the ground anyway. Hazel needed to be the person who kept coming back in the dark, and I needed to hold the land long enough for someone to dig under it. Marcus was quiet. And you needed to be the generation that made it a place people could actually come to, Roy said. Marcus looked at him. That's why you came back, Roy said. Not for me. The work needed what you know how to do. Marcus looked at the field for a moment. Then he said, Emmett would have been a difficult man to argue with. Roy said, he would have listened to every word you said and then done exactly what he had decided to do before you started. Marcus said, so you're saying you're like him. Roy started the combine. Get down before I take the stubble pass, he said. Marcus climbed down and Roy drove the last pass of the harvest while the evening came in and the stars came out, and the bottom 80 gave back what the season had put into it, the way it always had, the way it always would, as long as someone stayed to tend it and understood what staying meant. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.